There is something about the past that pulls at us, quietly, in the way that a half-remembered dream does, gently, without urgency, asking only that we follow it a little further into the dark. Tonight, the past we are following is not a battlefield or a royal court. It is something much quieter than that. It is a dressing room. It is a wardrobe of silk and whalebone and velvet. It is a woman standing very still while someone pulls a cord tighter and tighter around her waist. It is a man in a top hat walking through a factory full of smoke. It is a child with small fingers working in candlelight, sewing tiny beads onto the hem of a gown that will one day kill the woman who wears it. Tonight, you are entering the world of Victorian fashion, and it is beautiful in the way that all dangerous things can be beautiful, slowly, seductively, and entirely without mercy. So settle in. Let the night gather around you. There is no hurry here. We have all the time in the world. Before we begin, and truly, we are in no rush if you find yourself drawn to these kinds of quiet, slow journeys through history, the kind of story that asks nothing of you but that you simply listen, then perhaps consider subscribing to this channel. There is more here waiting for you, nights full of old stories, forgotten people, rooms that history has nearly closed the door on forever. And if you are new here tonight, welcome. We are very glad you came. Now, let us go back. The world that made the clothes London, sometime in the 1840s. The rain is falling. It falls the way London rain always falls, not dramatically, not in sheets or curtains as they write in novels, but quietly, persistently, in fine gray drops that cling to everything they touch, to the cobblestones, to the iron railings, to the black wool coats of the men walking quickly along the pavement, to the hems of women's skirts, which drag slightly through puddles no one has thought to avoid, because the skirts are already so wide, so enormous, that avoiding puddles is more or less an impossibility. This is the Victorian world, or rather, this is one small corner of it, this wet London street in the 1840s, with its gas lamps just beginning to glow as the afternoon gives way to something colder and darker. But the street is only the beginning. Behind every window along this road, there is a world, and every one of those worlds has something to do with what people are wearing. Let us step back for a moment and look at the whole picture, not just the street, but the era. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. She was 18 years old. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, some accounts say, and she had round blue eyes and dark hair and a voice that people described as unusually clear, almost bell-like. She would reign for 63 years until 1901, and in that time the world would change so comprehensively, so thoroughly, that someone born at the beginning of her reign and still living at its end would have found themselves in a world that was almost unrecognizable. Railways, telegraphs, photography, the first automobiles, anesthesia, germ theory, the first department stores, the first ready-made clothing. The expansion of the British Empire to cover roughly 1/4 of the Earth's surface. And through all of it, through every decade of change and invention and upheaval, the people of Victorian Britain, and much of the Western world that looked to Britain and to Paris for guidance on such things, were deeply, almost pathologically, preoccupied with what they were wearing. This is not as shallow as it sounds. Or rather, it is shallow and deep at the same time, in the way that most human obsessions tend to be. Fashion in the Victorian era was not simply about aesthetics. It was a language, it was a moral system. It was a set of rules so complex and so demanding that breaking them, even inadvertently, could have serious social consequences. It was a performance that began the moment you rose from bed in the morning and did not end until you removed your nightcap and finally, gratefully, lay down again. And it was, as we shall discover slowly and carefully over the course of this long night together, frequently and sometimes fatally dangerous. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us slow down. The night is long and there is no reason to rush. To understand why Victorian fashion became what it became, why it developed its particular shape, its particular obsessions, its particular cruelties, we need to understand the world that produced it. And that world was a world of extraordinary contradiction. On one hand, the Victorian era was a time of tremendous optimism. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping Britain from an agricultural society into an industrial one at a pace that no previous generation had experienced. Factories were producing goods in quantities that would have seemed miraculous 100 years earlier. Railways were shrinking distances that had once taken weeks to travel. The middle class was expanding, and with it, the market for things, for goods, for clothes, for furniture, for the thousand small objects that furnished a comfortable home and a respectable life. And on the other hand, for every comfortable home, there was a slum. For every silk dress, there was a seamstress half blind from working by candlelight. For every factory producing cheap cloth, there were children working in it. For every woman in a beautiful gown attending a ball, there was a woman who had made that gown, working in conditions that would strike us today as barely survivable. This is the contradiction at the heart of Victorian fashion. It was an industry built on the labor of people who could not afford to wear the things they made, producing garments that were themselves, in many cases, quietly lethal to the people who wore them. Let us begin at the beginning, with the fabric, with the thread. With the raw materials of beauty. Cotton came from America, from the American South, picked by enslaved people on vast plantations that stretched across states. This is not a tangent. It is a thread that runs directly into the fabric of Victorian fashion, because the cheap cotton that flooded British mills in the mid-19th century was the foundation of the Victorian textile industry. When American cotton arrived in Liverpool and Manchester, it was transformed, spun, woven, dyed, and finished, and then sent out into the world as cloth, as dress fabric, as lining, as undergarments, as all the layers that a Victorian woman was expected to wear beneath and over and around her body. The mills where this happened were remarkable places, if remarkable is a word that can encompass both impressive and horrifying simultaneously. They were enormous, loud beyond description, full of machinery that moved at speeds that seemed almost impossible. The air inside them was thick with cotton dust, fine white particles that hung in the air like a kind of permanent fog, settling on every surface, on every person, getting into eyes and noses and lungs. The workers in these mills, and many of them were children, some as young as 9 or 10, breathed this air for 12 or 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The disease that resulted had a number of names over the years, but the one that eventually stuck was bisonosis, cotton worker's lung, a slow, progressive destruction of the lungs that caused breathlessness, coughing, and eventually a kind of suffocation that could take years to complete. This is where Victorian fashion begins, not in a dressmaker's salon in Paris, not in the elegant showrooms of a London tailor. In a mill in Lancashire, in a cloud of cotton dust, with the sound of machinery so loud you could not hear the person standing next to you even if you shouted. But let us move on. Let us follow the fabric. Silk came from China and from France, from the silk-producing regions around Lyon, where families of weavers had been producing exquisite fabrics for centuries. Silk weaving was skilled work, among the most skilled in any textile trade, and the Lyonese silk weavers, the Connaughts as they were called, were proud of their craft in the way that only people who have devoted their entire lives to something can be proud. They worked on enormous jacquard looms, machines that used punched cards to control the pattern of the weave, producing silk so fine and complex that looking at it closely was like looking at a painting. Every flower, every leaf, every geometric repeat was built thread by thread, pass by pass of the shuttle. The Carnats were also, as it happened, among the most politically radical workers in France. They rioted in 1831 and again in 1834, protesting wages that were falling even as the quality of work they produced remained extraordinary. They were paid per ell of fabric, an ell being an old unit of measurement roughly equivalent to 45 inches, and the price per ell was set by the silk merchants, who had every incentive to keep it as low as possible. The Carnats had almost no power to push back. They could strike, and they did, and troops came and the strikes were broken, and the work continued. The silk that came out of Lyon was beautiful. Of course it was. That was never in question. The people who made it were skilled and dedicated and took genuine pride in their work. The silk went to London, to Paris, to Vienna, to New York. It was made into evening gowns and ball gowns and wedding dresses. It was worn by women who had no idea where it came from or what its making had cost the people who produced it. This is not a peculiarity of the Victorian era. This is the nature of fashion in almost every era. But in the Victorian era, the gap between the beauty of the finished product and the darkness of its production was particularly stark, particularly wide, and in many cases particularly lethal. Let us keep following the thread. Wool came from sheep, naturally enough, but also from the people who processed it, the sorters, the spinners, the weavers, the dyers. Wool sorting was an occupation with a specific and terrible occupational hazard: anthrax. The spores of Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax, could survive for years, even decades, in wool from infected animals. And since much of the raw wool processed in Victorian Britain came from countries where anthrax was common in livestock, Turkey, Persia, Russia, the workers who handled that wool were regularly exposed. Wool sorters in Bradford, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, where the wool trade was centered, developed a form of anthrax infection so reliably associated with their trade that it acquired its own name, wool sorters' disease. It was a pulmonary infection, anthrax of the lungs, and it was in the 19th century almost invariably fatal. You could be perfectly healthy on Monday and dead by Saturday if the spores had found their way into your lungs. The progression was rapid and merciless. Fever. Difficulty breathing, a sense of suffocation that worsened with each hour, and then nothing. Wool sorters' disease killed workers in Bradford for decades before anyone thought seriously about what might be done about it. The connection between the diseased wool and the dying workers was eventually established. Louis Pasteur's work on germ theory in the 1860s and 1870s was beginning to change the way scientists thought about disease, but the practical measures needed to protect workers came slowly, reluctantly, and only under sustained pressure from labor activists and public health reformers. In the meantime, the wool kept coming, the workers kept sorting it, and the fabric kept being made. I want to pause here for a moment and just let things settle, because we have covered a lot of ground already, and there is so much more ahead of us, and I think the best way to take in a story like this, a story that is at once about beauty and danger, about elegance and suffering, is to let it come slowly, to let each piece of it sit for a moment before the next arrives. So let us rest here briefly in the world of raw materials. In the mills and the workshops and the spinning rooms and the dye houses, let us acknowledge that every piece of Victorian clothing, every dress and coat and bonnet and glove and pair of stockings was the product of labor that was mostly invisible to the people who wore the finished result. The woman who wore a silk evening gown to a ball in 1860 could not have traced the provenance of every thread in her dress, even if she had wanted to. She did not know the name of the silk weaver in Lyon. She did not know the name of the cotton picker in Georgia. She did not know the name of the wool sorter in Bradford who had died of wool sorter's disease 3 months ago. She knew only that her dress was beautiful, and it genuinely was. Let that contradiction sit with you for a while as we move on. The shape of a woman, the corset and its discontents. There is a word that comes up again and again whenever people talk about Victorian fashion. It comes up in books, in museum exhibits, in documentary films, in the kinds of articles with titles that begin with "the surprising truth about." And it is a word that carries a great deal of weight, literally and figuratively. That word is corset, and I want to talk about it carefully and honestly and at some length because the story of the Victorian corset is one of the most complicated and most contested stories in the history of fashion. It is a story about beauty, about discomfort, about social control, about medicine, about class, and about the extraordinary and sometimes terrifying things that people will endure in the name of an ideal. But first, let us understand what a corset actually was. A corset, or stays, as the earlier versions were often called, was a structured undergarment designed to shape the torso. It was typically made of a sturdy fabric, linen, cotton, or cowtil, a closely woven twill designed specifically for the purpose, stiffened with a framework of rigid elements called boning. In the early Victorian era, this boning was made of whalebone specifically, from the baleen plates of certain species of whale, which are flexible, strong, and surprisingly resistant to cracking. Later in the century, as whale populations declined and the technology of manufacturing improved, steel began to replace whalebone. Steel was cheaper, more consistent, and in some ways more effective, though it had less give to it, less of the slight organic flexibility that baleen possessed. The corset was laced at the back, and sometimes also fastened with hooks or a busk, a rigid panel at the front that could be undone for dressing and undressing. The lacing at the back could be tightened or loosened, and the degree of tightness was something that varied enormously depending on the woman, the occasion, the era, and her personal preference and tolerance. Here is where the story becomes complicated. For most of the 19th century, the corset was simply part of what a woman wore. It was an undergarment, like a petticoat or a chemise. It was worn by women of almost every social class, though the quality and construction varied enormously depending on how much money you had. A wealthy woman's corset might be custom-made to her specific measurements, beautifully constructed from the finest materials, and carefully adjusted over time to fit perfectly. A factory worker's corset might be a cheap, mass-produced item, purchased from a market stall, that fit approximately rather than exactly. For most women, the corset was tight enough to give the torso the fashionable shape of the era, but not so tight as to cause significant physical harm. The body was compressed, yes. The waist was made to appear smaller than its natural circumference. The bust was supported and shaped. The posture was subtly affected. The corset made it harder to slouch, which was considered a social virtue. But for most women, most of the time, the corset was an item of functional discomfort rather than serious medical danger. And then there was tight lacing. Tight lacing was a practice, never universal, always controversial even within Victorian society, of lacing the corset so tightly that the waist was reduced far beyond its natural size. The ideal waist circumference promoted by the most extreme practitioners of tight lacing was around 18 inches. For context, the average adult woman's natural waist circumference was roughly 26 to 28 inches. A reduction to 18 inches represents a compression of 8 to 10 inches, which is an enormous amount. Was this actually achieved? The honest answer is, sometimes by some women after years of practice. The human body, particularly a body that has been gradually shaped from adolescence onward, can adapt to significant compression. The floating ribs, the lower ribs, which are not attached to the sternum, can be moved over time. The organs of the abdomen can shift. The shape of the whole torso can change in ways that seem impossible from a purely anatomical standpoint. But the damage, the internal organs, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, when compressed over years, could be permanently displaced. The ribs, forced inward and downward, could fracture, could develop unusual curvatures. The lungs, given less space to expand, could reduce in capacity. The stomach, compressed into a narrow vertical space, could develop chronic indigestion, difficulty eating, nausea, and in some cases, vomiting. The diaphragm, the muscle responsible for breathing, was particularly affected. Compressed from below by displaced abdominal organs and from above by a constricted chest, the diaphragm could not move properly. Women who tight-laced chronically often developed a shallow, rapid style of breathing, chest breathing rather than abdominal breathing. That was both a symptom and a cause of ongoing problems. The fainting that Victorians attributed to weak nerves or delicate constitutions was in many cases simply a failure of oxygenation. A woman whose corset was laced too tightly could not take a deep enough breath to maintain adequate oxygen levels during exertion. She fainted. This was not a mystery. It was mechanics, and yet, and here is the truly strange thing, fainting was not always seen as a problem. In certain circles of Victorian society, a tendency to faint was associated with delicacy, with femininity, with a certain refined sensitivity that was considered characteristic of the upper and middle classes. A woman who never fainted might be suspected of being robust in a way that was slightly vulgar, slightly too physical, too earthy. The woman who occasionally swooned in the parlor was, in a peculiar way, performing her femininity. I want to be careful here not to be reductive about this. The women who wore corsets, even those who tight-laced, were not simply passive victims of male aesthetic demands. Many of them made active choices about how they dressed. Some of them found the corset comfortable, or at least comforting, in the way that any firmly structured garment can create a sense of support and containment. Some of them were deeply invested in the fashion of the era and wore their corsets with pride. Some of them pushed back against the most extreme demands of fashion and wore their corsets as loosely as they could get away with. But many of them were also operating within constraints, social, economic, familial, that made genuine free choice difficult or impossible. A woman who refused to wear a corset in 1860 was making a statement that had social consequences. She might be considered eccentric. She might be seen as lacking in respectability. She might find herself quietly excluded from social circles that mattered to her, or to her family, or to her prospects for marriage. The pressure to conform was real. It was not always physical coercion, but it was real. And so women wore corsets, and some of them suffered for it. And the fashion continued, decade after decade, adapting its shape slightly as the fashionable silhouette changed, but always present, always exerting its particular pressure on the bodies beneath the silk and the velvet and the lace. Let us talk about the shape of the Victorian era, because it is not a single shape. Fashion changed decade by decade, and the silhouette that we tend to think of as Victorian, the tiny waist, the full skirt, the high neckline, is actually a composite of several different silhouettes, each associated with a different decade of the long Victorian reign. In the 1840s, the silhouette was relatively modest by the standards of what was to come. Skirts were full but not enormous. The waist was nipped in, but not to extreme degrees. Sleeves were tight at the wrist, fitted at the upper arm. The overall impression was of a kind of contained elegance, everything close to the body except the skirt, which flowed out from a natural waistline in smooth, graceful folds. Then came the 1850s, and the crinoline. The word crinoline originally referred to a stiffened fabric made from horsehair, crin, in French, used to line and support petticoats and skirts. But in the 1850s, it became associated with the cage crinoline, one of the most extraordinary and most discussed garments in the history of fashion. The cage crinoline was a framework of graduated steel hoops connected by vertical tapes worn under the skirts that held them out in a vast dome around the wearer. At its most extreme, in the mid-1860s, a fashionable crinoline could give a skirt a circumference of 15 or 18 feet. 15 to 18 feet. Stop and think about that for a moment. A woman in a fashionable crinoline was occupying, in terms of horizontal space, roughly the same amount of floor area as a dining table. She could not sit in an ordinary chair without the front of her skirts flying up. She could not pass through a standard doorway without turning sideways. She could not sit near a fire without risking her skirts catching alight, and they did catch alight, frequently. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented reality of Victorian life, one of the specific and terrible dangers that the crinoline introduced. The steel hoops held the fabric of the skirt away from the body, creating a kind of tent of air beneath it. When the edge of the skirt came near a fire, a hearth, a candle, a gas lamp, the fabric could ignite and the air beneath could feed the flames, and the fire could travel up the inside of the skirt with terrifying speed. The woman was, in effect, enclosed in an incinerating structure from which she could not easily escape, because the hoops of the crinoline made movement extremely difficult and running essentially impossible. The death toll from crinoline fires in the 1850s and 1860s was significant. Significant enough that newspapers reported on it regularly, that physicians wrote letters to The Lancet and other medical journals about it, that fire insurers worried about it. In 1858, a fire at a dance hall in Santiago, Chile, one of the few places in South America that had adopted European fashions to their most extreme degree, killed nearly 2,000 people, many of them women whose crinoline-supported skirts fed the fire that swept through the building. This is one of the most catastrophic single disasters attributable to fashion in recorded history, though it is rarely discussed outside of specialized historical literature. In England, the death toll was lower but steady. Women burned to death in their own parlors, their skirts having drifted too close to the hearth. Women burned while doing household tasks near kitchen fires. Women burned at parties and dances, their skirts ignited by a candle they had stepped too close to in a crowded room. Mrs. Oscar Wilde, née Isola Wilde, sister of Oscar, died in 1867 at the age of 22 after her dress caught fire. She was reaching over a fireplace and her skirts touched the flames. The injuries were severe enough that she died a few weeks later. The crinoline was not merely a fashion statement. In some very literal ways, it was a fire hazard walking through the world. And yet, The women who wore crinolines were not simply passive recipients of a dangerous fashion handed to them by men. Many of them actively loved their crinolines. Not in spite of the inconvenience and the danger, but alongside it, or perhaps simply untroubled by risks that seemed abstract against the very concrete pleasure of feeling beautiful and fashionable and correctly attired for one's time and place. There are letters from Victorian women who describe putting on their crinoline with something close to delight, the sense of the fabric swaying around you. The way it created a kind of personal space, a zone of untouchability, in a world where personal space was often in short supply. The way it made the waist look smaller without the extreme compression of tight lacing. The way it gave a kind of grandeur to movement, made every entrance into a room a small event. There is a magazine from 1857, an article written by a woman, for women, in which the author argues passionately in defense of the crinoline against its critics. She points out, quite correctly, that the crinoline is more comfortable in many ways than the layers of heavy petticoats it replaced. She argues that the width it creates around the body gives a woman physical autonomy. It is harder for people to press too close to you, to touch you without your consent. She finds the critics of the crinoline mostly to be men who are uncomfortable with the amount of space it requires women to occupy. This is not an unsophisticated argument. It is the kind of argument that feels remarkably contemporary, actually. The idea that fashion can be simultaneously constraining and empowering, simultaneously dangerous and pleasurable, is not a new idea. It is an old one, dressed up in different clothes in every era. But the fires were real, the burns were real, the deaths were real, and we need to hold both things at once, the pleasure of the wearer and the danger of the worn, without resolving the tension too quickly in either direction. The crinoline began to decline in the mid-1860s. Not suddenly, but gradually, the enormous domed shape began to flatten at the front and concentrate at the back. The hoop skirt became the half hoop, and then the half hoop became the bustle. The silhouette shifted from a 360-degree dome to something more like a crescent, flat in front, extravagant behind. The fabric piled up at the back of the skirt in a cascade of ruffles and drapery and pleats, sometimes supported by a separate structure called a bustle frame, sometimes simply by the architecture of the skirt itself. The first bustle era, roughly the mid-1860s to the late 1870s, gave way to a period of slimmer, more fitted skirts in the early 1880s, and then to the second bustle era of 1883 to 1889, in which the bustle returned in its most extreme form, a rigid, shelf-like protrusion at the back of the skirt that could extend several inches behind the body. These second-era bustles were remarkable objects. Some of them were made of steel or brass frameworks. Some were made of crinoline fabric stuffed with horsehair or cotton. Some were simply pads worn beneath the skirt, but at their most extreme, they created a silhouette that was almost architectural. The smooth, tight front of the dress, the sweeping curve of the back, the sudden dramatic projection of the bustle itself. Women who wore these dresses could not lean back in a chair without the bustle tipping them forward. They could not sit on an ordinary park bench without the bustle displacing them to the front of the seat. They needed special chairs, armless, with a low back, to sit comfortably at all. The bustle also created specific problems of pressure. The framework of a bustle, worn at the back of the hips, was sitting directly on the lower spine and the sacrum. Women who wore tight, heavily boned corsets over bustled skirts were experiencing simultaneous compression from the front and pressure from behind. and the combined effect on the spine and the pelvis was not trivial. Victorian physicians wrote about women presenting with lower back pain, with difficulty walking, with hip pain, and attributed it, sometimes correctly, to the combination of corset and bustle. But the bustle, too, had its advocates. It gave a particular grace to movement, the way the skirt swept and followed behind you. It created an illusion of height. It made the waist look smaller by providing a dramatic contrast of volume. And by the late 1880s, it was simply what fashionable women wore, as unremarkable in its way as the particular cut of a jacket is today. The discomfort was background noise. The danger was theoretical. The beauty was immediate. I want to take another slow breath here and look at the picture we have assembled so far. We have a world of enormous industrial production, supplying fabric made at significant cost to the workers who made it. We have an era obsessed with the shape of the female body, using structures of whale bone and steel and horsehair to achieve an ideal that was simultaneously beautiful and damaging. We have women navigating a system that offered them real pleasures and real dangers simultaneously. And we have not yet talked about the colors. Oh, the colors of Victorian fashion. That is the next part of our story, and it is perhaps the most quietly terrifying of all. The colors that killed, arsenic green and the poison palette, if you were to look at a collection of well-preserved Victorian clothing in a museum. And there are several wonderful collections around the world, at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. One of the first things you would notice is the color. Victorian clothing could be extraordinarily vivid. Not the muted, faded tones that we often associate with old photographs, black and gray and sepia, but blazing, saturated color. Brilliant carmine reds, deep indigo blues, rich golden yellows and green. The greens of Victorian fashion were extraordinary. They ranged from the softest, most delicate sage to the most brilliant, almost electric emerald. They were the colors of spring leaves and of deep forest and of peacock feathers. They were achieved at various points in the 19th century through a variety of dyeing methods, some vegetable-based, some mineral, some synthetic, and some of them were made with a compound called emerald green, or sometimes Paris green, or sometimes in less formal contexts, Scheele's green, copper arsenite. That is what these green dyes were made from in whole or in part. A compound containing arsenic, one of the most reliably lethal poisons in the human pharmacopoeia. This is not a retrospective discovery. The connection between these green dyes and human illness was known, or at least suspected, for much of the Victorian era. It was written about. It was discussed in medical journals. There were investigations, parliamentary inquiries, newspaper articles expressing alarm. And yet the use of arsenic in green dyes continued for decades because the alternatives were either duller or more expensive or simply not yet available. Let us go back a little further to understand where these colors came from. Carl Wilhelm Scheele was a Swedish chemist working in the late 18th century, and he is responsible for the discovery of more chemical elements and compounds than almost any other scientist of his era: chlorine, manganese, oxygen, independently of Priestley, barium, molybdenum, tungsten, and among other compounds, a brilliant green pigment made from copper arsenite that bore his name for decades. Scheele's green was first produced around 1775. It was vivid, stable, and extraordinarily beautiful, a clear, bright green that did not fade or shift in the way that many organic green dyes did. It was also highly toxic. Scheele himself was aware that his compound contained arsenic, and arsenic's poisonous properties were well known long before Scheele was born. But the connection between the use of arsenic-based pigments and direct human harm was not immediately clear, partly because the mechanisms of arsenic poisoning were not well understood, and partly because the harm was slow, cumulative, and easy to attribute to other causes. Scheele's green was used in painting, in printing, in wallpaper. We will come back to the wallpaper, and in fabric dyeing. It was absorbed into the textile trade, and from there into the wardrobes of Victorian women and men. Then came 1814, and a German chemist named Wilhelm Sattler developed an improved version of the copper arsenite pigment, brighter, more stable, easier to work with. This was emerald green, sometimes called Paris green, and it became enormously popular. By the mid-Victorian era, it was being used to dye silk, cotton, wool, and even artificial flowers made of fabric. The artificial flower trade is one of the more quietly extraordinary corners of Victorian fashion, and it deserves a moment of our attention. Victorian women wore flowers in their hair, on their bonnets, on their dresses, at their waists, and at their bosoms. Fresh flowers were lovely but impractical. They wilted, they dropped petals, they needed to be replaced daily. Artificial flowers made from fabric, silk, gauze, fine cotton were the practical alternative. They could be made to look remarkably like the real thing, and they lasted indefinitely. The making of artificial flowers was a trade carried out almost entirely by women, often working at home in the putting out system. The employer would supply the materials. The women would take them home, do the work, and return the finished product for a fixed payment. It was low-paid, intermittent, and unglamorous. But in the 19th century, it employed thousands of women in London and other cities. The flowers made with emerald green dye were strikingly beautiful. The vivid, almost luminous green of the leaves and stems gave the arrangements a freshness and lifelike quality that other colors could not quite achieve, and the women who made them handled the dyed fabric constantly, cutting it, shaping it, trimming it, pressing it into shape with their fingers. The arsenic came off on their hands. It got under their fingernails. It was breathed in as fine dust when fabric was cut. It was slowly and steadily poisoning them. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning are not always obvious at first. They include fatigue, headache, nausea, skin irritation, symptoms that could be attributed to a dozen other causes, but over time they progress. Peripheral neuropathy, numbness and tingling in the hands and feet, loss of coordination, digestive problems, darkening of the skin in patches, and eventually organ failure, most commonly of the liver. The artificial flower makers who worked daily with arsenic-dyed fabrics experienced these symptoms. Some of them died. The connection between their work and their illness was made by some physicians, disputed by others, and largely ignored by the trade until sustained pressure from public health reformers and the development of less toxic dyes eventually made the change. One particular case from 1861 caught public attention. A young woman named Matilda Schura. She was 19 years old. She worked as an artificial flower maker in London, became seriously ill. Her symptoms were severe: convulsions, green vomiting, green discoloration of the whites of her eyes. A physician who examined her attributed her illness directly to arsenic exposure from the dyed flowers she worked with. She died. Her death was reported in the Times. It caused a brief public outcry. Questions were raised about the regulation of toxic dyes. And then, gradually, the public attention moved on, as public attention always does. The flower makers kept making flowers. The flowers kept being sold. The women who wore them in their hair wore the arsenic close to their skin, on a warm evening at a ball, where the heat of the room and the warmth of their bodies would cause the fabric to release more of the dye and more of the arsenic, and the process of slow poisoning continued. The flowers were not the only arsenic hazard in Victorian fashion. There were also the gloves. Green gloves, particularly those made of fine kid leather dyed with emerald green, were fashionable accessories throughout much of the mid-Victorian era. They were elegant, they were fashionable, and they were worn against the skin of the hands, often for hours at a time, in conditions, the warmth of gloved hands, the slight moisture of skin, that encouraged the release of arsenic compounds from the leather. The hands that wore those gloves were absorbing arsenic through the skin. Not in dramatic quantities, but steadily, over the course of an evening, over the course of many evenings worn over the years. Chronic low-level arsenic exposure, the kind that produces symptoms slowly enough that they are easy to attribute to other causes, fatigue, perhaps, headache, a slight digestive complaint, a persistent skin irritation that the family physician diagnoses as nerves. There is a particular kind of horror in the idea of something that kills you slowly and quietly, with symptoms that mimic ordinary illness so closely that neither you nor your doctor understand what is happening. And that is precisely the kind of horror that arsenic dyes represented, for the women who made the goods and for the women who wore them. And now we come to the wallpaper. I mentioned Scheele's green and its use in wallpaper. This deserves a chapter of its own, and it will get one, but let us touch on it here because it connects so directly to the world of fashion and color. Victorian wallpapers were often breathtakingly beautiful. The patterns were intricate, naturalistic designs of flowers and leaves and birds, geometric patterns, historical designs inspired by medieval or Renaissance textile patterns. And many of them were printed in a range of greens that contained arsenic, Scheele's green, emerald green, or related compounds. When these wallpapers were in good condition, they posed a limited risk, though not no risk. But when they became damp, in the chronically damp Victorian house, with its inadequate ventilation and its coal fires producing moisture, something worse happened. A mold, now known as Scopulariopsis brevicalis, could grow on the paste beneath the wallpaper, and in metabolizing the arsenic compounds in the paper, it produced a volatile organoarsenic compound called trimethylarsine. This compound was released into the air of the room as a gas, and the people in the room breathed it. The symptoms were, again, those of arsenic poisoning, but now in a form that seemed even more mysterious, because it was the air itself that was making people ill. People became sick in certain rooms and recovered when they left them. Children, who spent more time in nurseries that were papered in bright, cheerful green, and who slept in those rooms for hours every night, were particularly affected. Infants who failed to thrive, who were listless and pale and feverish, who improved when taken out of the house, who declined when brought back, some proportion of these cases, perhaps a significant proportion, were cases of chronic arsenic poisoning from the wallpaper in their rooms. This hypothesis, that Victorian wallpapers were a significant source of arsenic poisoning, was not widely accepted in the Victorian era itself, even though the chemist William Odling had raised the alarm about arsenic in wallpapers in the 1850s, and even though specific cases of illness associated with green wallpapers were reported repeatedly in medical literature. The idea that the beautiful paper on your drawing room walls was slowly poisoning your family was deeply unsettling and deeply disruptive to the profitable wallpaper industry. There was predictably resistance. There is a persistent but unverified story that Napoleon Bonaparte died, at least in part, from arsenic poisoning originating in the green wallpaper of his room at Longwood House on St. Helena. The wallpaper, there was a Scheele's green pattern. Samples of Napoleon's hair, analyzed in the 20th century, showed arsenic levels consistent with chronic poisoning. Whether this was the wallpaper or deliberate poisoning, or simply the arsenic-containing medicines that were routinely given to sick people in the early 19th century, has never been definitively established. But the story is suggestive of the broader reality that in the Victorian era, arsenic was so deeply woven into everyday life and everyday objects that it is genuinely difficult to determine, in retrospect, how much harm it actually did. The arsenic problem was not limited to green. Other colors of Victorian fabric dye also had their dangers. The vivid yellows and oranges of the era sometimes contained chrome compounds, chromates, that were toxic to the skin and to the respiratory system. The brilliant scarlet red achieved in the 1850s by a new synthetic dye called fuchsine, the first of the aniline dyes, a whole class of synthetic colors derived from coal tar, turned out to cause skin sensitization, and in workers who handled it in large quantities, significant illness. The aniline dye revolution of the mid-Victorian era is a fascinating story in itself. William Perkin, an 18-year-old chemistry student in London, accidentally discovered the first synthetic aniline dye, a rich purple called mauvine, or simply mauve, in 1856 while trying to synthesize quinine in his home laboratory. He recognized the commercial potential of his discovery, patented it, built a factory, and changed the history of color. Mauve became fashionable almost overnight. Queen Victoria wore a mauve gown. The fashion world adopted it, and the synthetic dye industry was born. The synthetic dyes that followed mauve, fuchsine, brilliant blue, alizarin red, numerous others, were produced from coal tar, a byproduct of the coal gas industry that produced the gas used to light the streets and homes of Victorian cities. Coal tar was a dark, viscous, somewhat sinister-smelling substance, and the chemistry of extracting brilliant colors from it was both extraordinary and, for the workers who did it, sometimes dangerous. Aniline, the base compound from which many of the dyes were derived, is toxic, absorbed through the skin as well as by inhalation, and capable of causing serious harm with chronic exposure. Workers in aniline dye factories developed a specific constellation of symptoms, bladder problems most notably, including bladder cancer, which was identified as an occupational hazard of the aniline dye trade in the late 19th century. So the colors of Victorian fashion had a shadow that extended all the way back to the factories where they were made, and all the way through to the skin of the people who wore them. We are so far only beginning to understand the full scope of what Victorian fashion was doing to the people involved in every stage of its production and consumption. And the night deepens. The seamstresses, NEEDLES and CANDLES, and the long wait for dawn, and as the night deepens, let us shift our gaze. Let us move from the colors and the structures of Victorian fashion to the people who made it. Not the wealthy designers, there were very few of those in the modern sense, but the seamstresses, the dressmakers, the milliners, the tailors, the workers who actually put the garments together, stitch by stitch, by daylight and by candlelight, and by the early, flickering gas lamps that began to appear in workshops in the middle years of the century. There is a painting by Richard Redgrave, completed in 1844, called The Seamstress. It shows a young woman, thin and pale, sitting by a window in the gray light of early morning, working at her sewing. Her eyes are downcast. She is not picturesque in the way that other Victorian paintings of women are picturesque. She is simply tired, deeply, profoundly, bone-etchingly tired. The light through the window suggests dawn. She has worked through the night, and now morning has come and there is more work still to do. The painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy and was deeply noticed. People wrote about it. Thomas Hood wrote a poem that accompanied it, called The Song of the Shirt, which became one of the most widely read poems of the Victorian era. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread /stitch. Stitch, stitch, in poverty, hunger, and dirt. I won't quote more of it. It is a long poem, and it is under copyright, and in any case the point is made. The seamstress had become, by the 1840s, a figure that the public imagination had identified as a symbol of the worst of the industrial age's treatment of women. She was the woman behind the beautiful dress. She was the one who made the silk and the lace possible. And she was, by the standards of the era, one of the most exploited workers in the country. Let us understand why. Dressmaking in the Victorian era was organized around a system of apprenticeship. A young woman, usually between 12 and 16 years old, would be apprenticed to a dressmaking establishment. The arrangement was, on paper, one of mutual benefit. The establishment provided training, room and board, and eventually, a wage. The apprentice provided labor and in the beginning, often also a premium, a sum of money paid by the girl's family to secure the apprenticeship. In practice, the system was often exploitative to a degree that is difficult to exaggerate. The hours were the first problem. In the weeks leading up to the major events of the social calendar, the London season, which ran from spring to early summer, Christmas, the court presentations, major balls and parties, dressmaking establishments worked around the clock to fulfill orders. The system was driven by the absolute demands of wealthy clients who expected their gowns to be ready when they wanted them, and who thought nothing of placing an order 2 days before an event and expecting it to be completed on time. Parliamentary reports from the 1840s and 1850s, commissioned because of growing public concern about the conditions in dressmaking workrooms, contain testimony from workers who describe working 24 hours at a stretch, sometimes longer, with only brief breaks. 18 hours a day was considered a moderate working day during the busy season. Women testified to working without sleep for 36, 48 hours. One witness before a parliamentary committee described a period of 5 weeks during which she did not have a single complete night's sleep. This is not hyperbole. It is documented parliamentary testimony. The consequences for health were severe. Sleep deprivation alone would cause serious physical and cognitive effects. Combined with the other conditions of Victorian dressmaking workrooms, poor ventilation, inadequate lighting, crowded conditions, the effects were multiplied. The eye problems were perhaps the most characteristic occupational hazard of the seamstress's trade. Fine sewing, done by inadequate light, is one of the most demanding tasks the visual system can be asked to perform. In the era before electric lighting, dressmaking workrooms were lit by candles or by early gas lamps, both of which produce warm, flickering light that creates glare, shadows, and a kind of visual fatigue that builds over hours into something like pain. Victorian seamstresses worked by this light for hours that we can barely imagine. The result was predictable: a very high rate of myopia, of premature eye strain, of headaches so severe they interfered with work, and eventually, for many women, a significant deterioration in vision that made further fine work impossible. There is also evidence from the medical literature of the era, from the descriptions in charitable surveys, from parliamentary testimony, of a specific condition sometimes called dressmaker's eye, though it had various names in various sources. This was a condition of chronic inflammation and irritation of the eyes, sometimes involving the conjunctiva, sometimes affecting the cornea, sometimes producing a sensitivity to light so severe that working in any lighting conditions became painful. Today, we would recognize many of these cases as symptoms of chronic eye strain combined with poor nutritional status. Both vitamin A deficiency and various B vitamin deficiencies affect eye health significantly, and the diet of many Victorian seamstresses was, by any standard, inadequate. The posture problems were equally significant. Sewing requires a particular position, bent over the work, neck curved downward, shoulders hunched slightly forward, one arm raised and moving repeatedly in the action of stitching. This position, maintained for 10, 12, 15, 18 hours a day, created a specific set of musculoskeletal problems: neck pain, shoulder pain, upper back pain. A particular kind of forward curvature of the upper spine, a kyphosis, that developed in women who had spent years in the sewing position, and that could eventually become permanent. There are descriptions in Victorian medical literature, in the journals of hospital physicians, in the reports of sanitary inspectors, of seamstresses in their 30s who had the physical appearance of women 20 years older. Not in their faces, but in their posture, hunched, forward curving, moving carefully as if pain were a constant companion. These were not women with any dramatic or visible illness. They were simply worn out, physically, incrementally worn out, by years of work done in positions that the human body was not designed to sustain. And then there was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis consumption, as it was called in the Victorian era, killed more people in the 19th century than perhaps any other infectious disease. It was endemic in urban populations, transmitted through the air in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, fed by poverty and malnutrition and overwork, and the conditions of industrial urban life. It killed indiscriminately in terms of age: children, young adults, the middle-aged, though young adults, particularly young women in the 15 to 35 age bracket, were particularly vulnerable. The dressmaking workrooms of Victorian London and other industrial cities were ideal environments for the transmission of tuberculosis. They were crowded. They were poorly ventilated. They were full of women who were already physically compromised by overwork and inadequate nutrition and sleep deprivation. The bacterium that causes tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, spread through droplets expelled in coughing and breathing, and in a room full of exhausted women working in close proximity, it spread readily. Tuberculosis has a slow, variable natural history. A person infected with the bacterium might remain apparently healthy for months or years before becoming seriously ill. The symptoms when they developed were insidious: fatigue, weight loss, a persistent cough, low-grade fever in the evenings, night sweats. The gradual deterioration that gave the disease its older name, consumption, because it seemed to consume the person from within, leaving them thinner and paler and more fragile as the months passed. The Victorian era romanticized tuberculosis in ways that are difficult to understand from a modern perspective. The pallor, the thinness, the delicacy of movement, these were associated, in art and literature, with a kind of refined sensitivity. The consumptive heroine of Victorian fiction and opera, Mimi in Bohème, Violetta in La Traviata, the heroines of countless novels, was beautiful precisely because she was ill, her beauty made more poignant by its transience. The flesh was wasting, but the spirit was clarified. This romanticization had real consequences. It made tuberculosis seem almost aesthetic, almost desirable in a strange way. It produced the very qualities that fashionable society valued in women: pallor, slenderness, a tendency to tire easily, eyes bright with fever. The ill woman and the fashionable woman were, in the Victorian aesthetic imagination, sometimes barely distinguishable. For the seamstress dying of tuberculosis in a workroom in Whitechapel, the romance was not very apparent. The reality was a painful, prolonged deterioration in conditions of poverty and overwork, ending in a death that, for most working-class women, came without the benefit of good medical care, comfortable surroundings, or the kind of tender attentions that the fictional consumptive heroine received from her devoted lover. We should also talk about what the seamstresses ate. Because nutrition is part of this story too, parliamentary surveys of seamstresses' working conditions in the 1840s and 1850s include, alongside the testimony about working hours and accommodation, descriptions of what the workers were fed. The picture is not encouraging. In many establishments, food was provided as part of the terms of employment, but the quality and quantity varied enormously. There are accounts of establishments where the workers received adequate, if plain, meals. There are also accounts, and these are the majority, where the food was insufficient, poorly cooked, and nutritionally inadequate. The standard working-class diet of the Victorian era was dominated by bread, white bread, by mid-century, because the new roller mills could produce white flour cheaply and quickly, and white bread was considered more desirable than brown. This bread was accompanied by small amounts of butter or dripping, sometimes by a little tea or coffee, sometimes by a modest portion of some protein, salt fish, perhaps, or a scraping of lard. Vegetables were expensive and often unavailable to workers. Fresh fruit was a luxury. Meat was eaten rarely, if at all. This diet produced specific nutritional deficiencies that had specific physical effects. Vitamin C deficiency, scurvy, was more common among the urban poor than historical accounts usually acknowledge. Vitamin D deficiency produced rickets in children and various bone-related problems in adults. Iron deficiency anemia was extremely common among women who lose iron through menstruation and who were getting very little meat or other iron-rich foods. Anemia produced fatigue, weakness, pallor, and shortness of breath, symptoms that again could easily be attributed to other causes, to weakness of constitution, to overwork, to the general miseries of poverty, rather than to a specific and correctable nutritional lack. A seamstress working 18 hours a day, underfed, living in a crowded dormitory, breathing the recycled air of a workroom full of exhausted women. Her body was under assault from multiple directions simultaneously. It is remarkable, in retrospect, not that many of them died young, but that so many of them survived. The system was not, of course, entirely uniform. There were dressmaking establishments that treated their workers reasonably well, that maintained tolerable working hours, that provided decent food and adequate sleeping quarters. There were employers who were genuinely concerned about the welfare of the women in their workshops. These establishments existed. They are documented in the same surveys that document the worst cases, but they were not the norm. And even in the better establishments, the structural conditions of the trade, the demand for long hours in the season, the putting out system with its piece rates, the absence of any legal protection for working hours, the vulnerability of women with no alternative source of income created pressures that individual employers with good intentions could mitigate but not eliminate. Reform came, but it came slowly. The Factory Acts that gradually extended legal protection to workers in manufacturing industries through the 19th century were slower to cover the domestic and workshop-based trades, the dressmakers, the milliners, the outworkers, than they were to cover the mill workers. The people working in large, visible factories were more accessible to reform than the people scattered across hundreds of small workshops and home-based operations. The Shop Hours Act of 1892, the Factory and Workshop Act of 1895, these eventually brought some regulation to the dressmaking trade. But for the women who worked in it before those protections arrived, there was very little. There was only the needle and the candle and the long dark hours of the night and the dress that someone else would wear to a ball. The Mercury Hatters and other stories of trade. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, there was the hat. The Victorian gentleman's top hat was one of the most recognizable symbols of the era. Tall, straight-sided, gleaming, a column of silk or felt perched on the head with the studied carelessness that is actually the result of careful attention. The top hat was not merely a covering for the head, it was a declaration. It announced class, it announced respectability, it announced seriousness of purpose. No Victorian gentleman of any pretension was without his top hat. And the felt from which many hats were made, not the top hat, usually, which was more likely to be silk plush, but a wide range of other felt hats worn by men and women alike, was made by a process that involved mercury. Hat felt in the Victorian era was most commonly made from animal fur, rabbit, beaver, hair, which was processed through a technique called carroting. In carroting, the fur was treated with a solution of mercuric nitrate, which roughened the surface of the individual hairs and made them mat together more readily when the felt was formed. The mercury helped produce a smoother, denser, more durable felt than could be achieved without it. The workers who carried out this process, the hatters, in their workshops in Luton, in Stockport, in Southwark, in the hat-making towns of England and France and America, were chronically exposed to mercury vapors. Mercury is volatile at room temperature. It evaporates slowly and steadily, and in a warm, poorly ventilated workshop, the concentration of mercury vapor in the air could be significant. Chronic mercury poisoning produces a constellation of effects that are now well recognized, but that were, in the Victorian era, partially understood at best. The physical effects include tremor, a fine, involuntary shaking of the hands that made precision work increasingly difficult, and that could eventually affect the whole body. There were also effects on gait, a shuffling, unsteady walk, and there were effects on vision and on the kidneys. But the most striking effects were psychiatric. Mercury poisoning produces personality changes, mood disturbances, and cognitive impairment. The affected person becomes irritable, then anxious, then unstable, then frankly disturbed. There can be hallucinations. There can be episodes of rage or of profound depression. There can be a deterioration of social function. The person becomes withdrawn, erratic, difficult to be around. This combination of physical and psychiatric symptoms was so consistent among hatters that it gave rise to the phrase that has passed into common language, mad as a hatter, the Mad Hatter. The hatter who was visibly, undeniably, somewhat unhinged. This was not a figure of speech derived from nothing. It was derived from the observable reality of hat making as an occupation. Hatters who had worked in the trade for years sometimes developed a recognizable syndrome, the tremors, the erratic behavior, the instability that their neighbors and families recognized as an occupational hazard, even if they did not understand the mechanism. Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter, in Alice in Wonderland, published in 1865, was drawing on a cultural archetype that every Victorian reader would have recognized immediately. The Mad Hatter was not an invention. He was a portrait. The mercury in felt processing is one part of a broader story about occupational disease in Victorian-era craft and manufacturing trades, a story that intersects with fashion at many points. Tanners, the workers who processed animal hides into leather for shoes and gloves and belts, worked in vats of acidic or alkaline solutions that were hard on the skin and sometimes on the respiratory system. The lime used in the early stages of tanning was caustic. The acids used in later stages could cause chemical burns. The smell of a Victorian tannery was, by all accounts, extraordinary in its intensity, and the workers who spent their lives in that smell breathed compounds that did their lungs no good at all. Shoemakers sitting in their workshops cobbling and lasting shoes all day were often found to develop significant problems with the neck and upper spine. The shoemaker's stoop was a recognized phenomenon, the result of years spent bent over a last in a particular posture that loaded the cervical spine in ways it was not designed for. Button makers who made the thousands of buttons needed for Victorian clothing, buttons made from shell, from bone, from jet, from glass, from brass, from celluloid in the later years of the century, worked with machinery that occasionally took fingers, and with materials that sometimes had their own toxicities. Celluloid, introduced in the 1870s as a material for shirt collars and cuffs and buttons, was extraordinarily flammable. It was made from nitrocellulose, a relative of gun cotton, and there were incidents, occasionally dramatic ones, in which celluloid articles burst into flames on contact with heat or even friction. Lace makers, particularly the hand lace makers of Devon and Nottingham, whose work was the finest and most valued, worked in conditions similar to the seamstresses, with similar consequences for their eyes and their posture. Pillow lace, made on a lace pillow using bobbins, required even more intense concentration than sewing because the pattern had to be held in the mind while the hands worked mechanically. Women who had been making lace since childhood often had failing eyesight by their 20s and were unable to continue the work that had defined their lives. Feather workers, those who cleaned, sorted, dyed, and trimmed the feathers used in the enormous millinery industry of the Victorian era, breathed feather dust all day, with predictable consequences for their respiratory health. Feathers carried parasites and bacteria. The chemical treatments used to preserve and clean them were sometimes toxic. The workshops where they were processed were often small and poorly ventilated, and the millinery trade itself, the making of hats, was an industry with its own particular hazards, distinct from those of the hatters we have already discussed. Milliners who made and trimmed women's hats worked with feathers, ribbons, artificial flowers, wire frames, and all the paraphernalia of Victorian hat decoration. The wire frames required bending, and the tools used to bend them occasionally slipped. The wire itself, of various gauges and metals, sometimes had sharp ends that caused minor injuries, minor wounds that, in the pre-antiseptic era, could become infected and occasionally did so seriously. I want to pause here again and just sit with what we have been building. We have, over the course of this night, been slowly assembling a picture of Victorian fashion as an industry, a vast, interconnected system of production that stretched from cotton fields to silk workshops to dye factories to dressmaking rooms to the ballrooms and drawing rooms where the final product was displayed. And at every stage of that system, there were human beings doing work that was harming them. Some of the harm was dramatic. The deaths from crinoline fires, the acute illnesses of the artificial flower makers. Some of it was quiet and cumulative, the gradual deterioration of vision in the seamstress, the slow poisoning of the Mercury Hatter, the incremental lung damage of the cotton worker. And the people who wore the clothes, the wealthy women at the top of the consumption chain, were not entirely exempt from the dangers either. The arsenic in the fabric they wore, the compression of the corset, the fire risk of the crinoline. The fashion that was meant to protect them and adorn them and place them correctly in the social order was doing its own quiet damage. This is the dark truth that the title promised. Not a single dramatic revelation, but a pattern of danger woven so thoroughly into the fabric of Victorian fashion that it is, in retrospect, genuinely startling that anyone noticed, let alone cared, let alone changed anything. But they did notice, and they did care, and slowly things did change. Let us talk about the people who noticed. The reformers, VOICES in the dark Victorian reform, is a subject that is, in many ways, as interesting as Victorian excess. Because the Victorians who identified the problems of their era and tried to do something about them were often remarkable people, passionate, persistent, and operating against a current of economic interest and social convention that made their work genuinely difficult. The reform of fashion's most dangerous practices was a project that unfolded across many decades and many fronts, and it was driven by an unlikely coalition of physicians, journalists, feminists, and concerned ordinary people who simply believed that things could be better. Let us start with a doctor named Charles Turner Thackeray. Charles Turner Thackeray was a physician in Leeds in the 1820s and 1830s, and he wrote what is generally considered the first comprehensive English language study of occupational disease. His book, published in 1831, was called The Effects of Arts, Trades, and Professions, and of Civic States and Habits of Living, on Health and Longevity, a title that manages to contain within itself most of what the book is about. Thackeray went through trade by trade and occupation by occupation, documenting the specific health hazards associated with each, and proposing, with varying degrees of practical specificity, what might be done about them. His treatment of the textile trades is thorough. He discusses the cotton dust of the mills, the lead dust from the pottery industry, the mercury of the hatters, the specific postures required by various trades and their effects on the musculoskeletal system. He is, throughout, both scientifically careful and deeply humane. He is clearly genuinely distressed by what he has observed and documented. Thackeray died in 1833 at the age of 38 of tuberculosis. He was not an old man who had the luxury of seeing the changes he advocated take hold. He was a young man who saw the problem clearly and said so, and then died of one of the diseases that the conditions he had described produced. There is something very Victorian about that. The reform of dressmaking conditions specifically was driven, in the 1840s and 1850s, by a combination of journalistic exposure and parliamentary activism. The journalist Henry Mayhew, whose monumental Survey London Labour and the London Poor, published in installments from 1851, is one of the great documentary achievements of the Victorian era. Interviewed seamstresses, needle workers, and dressmakers, giving their experiences a public platform that they had never had before. Mayhew was a journalist of the old school. He went to people, he sat with them, he listened to them, he wrote down what they said in a way that preserved the texture of their speech and the specificity of their circumstances. The women he interviewed talked about their hours, their wages, their health. They talked about sewing by candlelight until they could no longer see. They talked about working for days without adequate sleep during the season. They talked about the girls who had come into the trade healthy and left it, if they left it, with failing eyes and recurring chest illnesses, and a kind of physical depletion that they struggled to describe, but that came through clearly in Mayhew's transcriptions. These interviews contributed to a public conversation that eventually led to parliamentary action. The various factory acts of the Victorian era, 1833, 1844, 1847, 1853, 1878, 1895, progressively extended protection to more categories of workers, imposed limits on working hours, required adequate ventilation and lighting in workshops, and created inspection systems to enforce compliance. Progress was painfully slow. The inspection systems were underfunded and understaffed. Employers found ways to avoid regulations. The piecework in putting out systems that employed large numbers of outworkers, people working in their own homes, were very difficult to regulate at all, because the home was private and inspectors had no right of entry without permission. But progress was real. By the end of the Victorian era, the most extreme abuses of the dressmaking trade were less common than they had been in the 1840s, and the legal framework that would eventually produce adequate protection had been established, even if it had not yet been fully implemented. The reform of the corset was a different kind of project because the corset was not an occupational hazard in the same sense. It was a personal choice, or something that looked like a personal choice, made by the women who wore it. And this meant that the reform arguments needed to be different. The most sustained medical campaign against the corset in the Victorian era was conducted by a group of physicians who framed their objections in terms of public health, and specifically in terms of the health of women as mothers. This was a strategic argument, not an entirely honest one. The reformers were trying to appeal to the Victorian era's investment in women's reproductive role as a way of persuading women to stop doing something that men were telling them was harmful. The argument went roughly like this. The corset, particularly when tight-laced, compresses the uterus and the other pelvic organs. It interferes with the normal development of the fetus in a pregnant woman. It produces children who are physically smaller and weaker than they would have been without the compression. It undermines the health of the nation by producing a generation of weaker, smaller people. Therefore, women should stop wearing it. This argument is historically interesting because it reveals the specific kind of power that could be marshaled in a Victorian medical reform argument, not the well-being of the woman herself, but the well-being of the children she might produce. The woman's own comfort, her own health, her own experience of her body, these were, in this argument, secondary. She mattered because of what she could produce, not because of what she herself experienced. There were, to be fair, other reformers who made the argument from the woman's own experience, who talked about the difficulty of breathing, the displacement of organs, the physical harm done to the wearer herself. The dress reform movement of the 1850s and onwards, associated with figures like Amelia Bloomer in America and the rational dress reformers in Britain, made arguments that were explicitly about women's comfort and freedom of movement. They proposed alternatives, loose, unstructured garments, or at least corsets worn much more loosely, and they wore these alternatives in public, and they were mocked and criticized and caricatured in the press. The mockery is itself instructive. When women reformers proposed wearing more comfortable clothes, they were accused of trying to unsex themselves, of rejecting their femininity, of being unwomanly or even unnatural. The cartoon versions of the dress reformer were always unflattering, sharp-featured, angular, unattractive, clearly not subject to the natural softening of womanhood that the corset supposedly preserved. These attacks were not random. They were a response to something genuinely threatening to the existing order. If women stopped wearing corsets, stopped wearing the structures that shaped them into the feminine ideal, what might they do next? The history of dress reform is, in this sense, inseparable from the history of women's rights more broadly. The same era that saw campaigns against the corset also saw campaigns for women's suffrage, for women's access to education and to the professions, for married women's property rights. The women who wore rational dress were sometimes, though not always, the same women who marched for the vote. The connection between control of the body and control of the political voice was not lost on either side. The reform of arsenic in dyes was perhaps the least contested of the Victorian fashion reform campaigns, at least in principle. By the 1870s and 1880s, the evidence was clear enough that the compounds being used to produce certain colors, particularly the emerald greens, were harmful not only to the workers who made and handled the dyed goods, but potentially also to the consumers who wore them. The question was what to do about it. The textile industry argued, predictably, that the risks were overstated, that the amounts of arsenic actually absorbed by ordinary wear were minimal, that the connection between the dyes and the illnesses was not proven with sufficient scientific rigor. These arguments were made in good faith by some people and in bad faith by others, but in any case they delayed meaningful action. The eventually effective response came from two directions simultaneously: from the development of less toxic alternative dyes and from consumer pressure. The development of new synthetic dyes through the 1860s and 1870s, building on Perkins' discovery of mauve, gradually provided alternatives to the most dangerous mineral compounds. Synthetic greens that did not contain arsenic became available, and as they became cheaper and more reliable, they displaced the more toxic alternatives. By the 1880s, the use of arsenic compounds in fabric dyes was declining significantly, though not eliminated entirely. Consumer pressure mattered too. As awareness of the arsenic issue spread through newspaper reporting, through the accounts of specific cases of illness, through the work of sanitary reformers, some consumers began to seek out products that were explicitly arsenic-free. This created a market incentive for manufacturers to reformulate their products and advertise them as safer. The phrase arsenic-free appeared on labels. This is, in some ways, a remarkably modern-sounding story. The health-conscious consumer exerting market pressure for safer products. The industry responding reluctantly but eventually. The regulatory framework lagging behind and catching up slowly. The pattern is familiar. The children's small hands in the big machine, and as the night deepens and the hour grows late, let us turn to a part of this story that is, in some ways, the most difficult to sit with. because we have talked about the adult workers, the seamstresses, the hatters, the flower makers. We have not yet talked at length about the children. Victorian fashion, like every Victorian industry, was substantially built on the labor of children. Not just in the textile mills, where child labor was most dramatically visible and most vigorously campaigned against, but throughout the whole supply chain, in the workshops, in the putting out system, in the homes where piecework was completed by the whole family, including the youngest members. The Factory Acts of 1833 and subsequent years set minimum age limits for employment in factories, first 9 years old, later raised. They were a genuine achievement of the reform movement. But they applied to factories, and much of the fashion industry was not organized as factories in the legal sense. The dressmaking workshops, the millinery shops, the home workers, many of these were outside the scope of factory legislation for decades. Children as young as 8 or 9 were employed in some dressmaking workshops as apprentices or errand girls. Children slightly older were doing skilled work, sewing, trimming, finishing garments by the light of candles or gas lamps, in the same long hours and cramped conditions that affected the adult workers. Their eyes, less robust than adult eyes, were perhaps more vulnerable to the strain of fine work in poor light. Their growing spines and developing musculoskeletal systems were more susceptible to the distortions produced by hours in the sewing position. The children who made artificial flowers were a particular concern to reformers. The green arsenic dye on the flowers they handled, the small hands that were more likely than adult hands to go to mouths, transferring the arsenic from fingers to lips. The children who lived in the same rooms where the work was done, breathing the same air that carried the fine particles of dyed fabric. Parliamentary witnesses who investigated the artificial flower trade in the 1860s and 1870s found children as young as 5 or 6 helping with the most basic parts of the work, holding pieces, threading wire through stems, arranging finished flowers, while older siblings and parents did the more skilled parts of the assembly. It was a family enterprise, a domestic operation, and the harm it did was distributed throughout the family, with the youngest members perhaps absorbing the most because they spent the most time in the room and were most likely to handle the materials without precautions. In the silk mills of Derby and of Macclesfield, children had worked since the late 18th century. The machinery of silk throwing, the process of twisting raw silk filaments together to make a thread strong enough to weave with, could be operated by small children, and the mill owners had organized their operations accordingly. Children of 6 or 7 worked in the throwing mills, performing simple, repetitive tasks, monitoring the threads, knotting broken ends, ensuring the machinery ran smoothly. The noise was a constant feature of the mills. The silk throwing machinery was quieter than cotton looms, but still substantial, a persistent mechanical sound that workers lived in for 12 hours a day. The effect of years of this noise on hearing was significant. Many mill workers, adults and children alike, developed significant hearing loss as they aged. The humidity in silk mills was also a specific hazard. Silk thread requires moisture to be worked effectively. Dry air makes it brittle and prone to breaking. Mills maintained high humidity through various means, and the workers breathed this damp air for their entire working day. Combined with poor ventilation and the crowding of workers in relatively small spaces, this created conditions favorable to the transmission of respiratory infections. The health survey data from industrial mill towns in the mid-Victorian era is stark. Life expectancy in mill districts was significantly lower than the national average. Child mortality was dramatically higher. The specific diseases associated with industrial conditions, tuberculosis above all, but also various respiratory illnesses, skin conditions, nutritional deficiencies, were concentrated in precisely the communities that worked in the textile industries. This is fashion's most distant and perhaps most challenging shadow. The beautiful fabric did not appear from nowhere. It came from these places, from these communities, from these children. Not all children involved in Victorian fashion were working class. There were also the children of the wealthy and the middle class, and fashion had its own different kind of impact on them. Victorian children's clothing was remarkable in its mimicry of adult fashion. Wealthy children were dressed as miniature adults, little boys in top hats and tail coats for formal occasions, little girls in layered skirts and fitted bodices. The fashionable silhouette of the adult world was reproduced in miniature on the children's bodies. For girls, this mimicry extended to the corset. From a young age, sometimes as young as 3 or 4 years old, girls from wealthy and middle-class families were dressed in stays, the child's version of the corset. These were lighter and less constrictive than adult corsets, but they were not without effect. The stays shaped the child's growing body, accustoming her to the sensation of support and compression that would be constant features of her life as an adult woman. They also, inevitably, affected the development of the growing spine and ribcage. Victorian medical opinion on child corsetry was divided. Some physicians argued strenuously against it, pointing to the developmental damage done to growing bones and organs. Others maintained that properly fitted stays were beneficial, providing support that young spines needed. This latter argument was sometimes made in good faith and was based on the medical understanding of the era, which was imperfect. We now know that the human spine does not need external support during normal development. It develops correctly without constraint, given adequate nutrition and appropriate physical activity. The girls who grew up in stays grew into women in corsets. The shape that fashion demanded had been built into their bodies from childhood. It was not simply that they had chosen to wear corsets. In some cases, the corset had shaped the body that wore it over years of developmental influence. Let us rest in this chapter for a moment. Let us acknowledge that what we are talking about is complex in the specific way that all historical injustice is complex. It was not done by obvious monsters, or not mostly. It was done by ordinary people, operating within the systems and assumptions and economic pressures of their time, often without any clear understanding of the harm they were causing. The mill owner who employed child labor was often not a villain in his own self-conception. He was a businessman. He was providing employment. He was operating within a legal framework. He may have genuinely believed, as many people of his era did, that working was better for children than idleness, that labor was morally improving, that the alternative for the children of the poor was something worse. He was wrong, but his wrongness was the wrongness of a person embedded in a system that structured his choices and his self-understanding in particular ways. This does not mean we cannot judge the system. We can and we should. But the judgment is directed at the system, at the assumptions, at the structures, not primarily at the individuals who were so thoroughly inside those structures that they could not see them clearly. The reformers who pushed back, Thackeray, Mayhew, the women of the rational dress movement, the physicians who documented occupational disease, these people were remarkable precisely because they could see, at least partially, what the system was doing. They were inside the same world as the mill owners and the dressmakers and the arsenic dye manufacturers, but they had achieved, somehow, a perspective from which the harm was visible. That is what historical consciousness is in a way. It is the perspective that sees the harm that contemporaries could not or would not see. The BIRDS and the BES, the feather trade and its consequences, and now, let us go somewhere a little different. Let us step outside the factories and the workrooms and the dressmakers' rooms, out into the wider world, into the natural world, and look at what Victorian fashion was doing to it. Because Victorian fashion did not only harm the people who made it and wore it, it harmed the world. And one of the most striking examples of this harm was the feather trade. The Victorian hat, the women's hat specifically, was one of the more spectacular products of the Victorian fashion industry. It was not modest, it was not subtle. It was, at its most elaborate, an astonishing confection of fabric, ribbon, artificial flowers, and above all feathers. Feathers of every size and color and provenance, from the small delicate feathers of songbirds to the great sweeping plumes of ostriches, from the iridescent neck feathers of peacocks to the luminous, shifting wing feathers of hummingbirds. The fashion for feather-trimmed hats reached its peak in the 1880s and 1890s, but it had been building for decades. By the 1880s, the millinery trade was consuming feathers in quantities that were genuinely alarming to anyone who thought about it carefully. And some people did think about it carefully. To achieve the effects that fashionable milliners required, birds were killed in enormous numbers. Not only the domestically raised birds, the ostrich farms that were established specifically to supply the trade, particularly in South Africa and in the American South, but wild birds in their millions. Egrets were killed for their breeding plumes, the delicate sprays of fine feathers that grow during the mating season and are more beautiful then than at any other time of year. Herons were shot. Birds of paradise were hunted to supply the fashion for their extraordinary decorative feathers. Hummingbirds, sometimes used entire, stuffed and mounted on hat brims, were taken in the Caribbean and Central America. The scale was almost incomprehensible. One London dealer in 1884 estimated that he processed feathers from approximately 14,000 dead birds per week. One auction at the London Commercial Sale Room in 1885 included 400 packages of herons' plumes, which might have come from many tens of thousands of birds. The 1888 report of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, an organization that had been founded precisely in response to the feather trade, documented the killing of so many egrets in Florida that the species was approaching local extinction. The killing was not always quick or merciful. Egrets were shot during the breeding season precisely because their breeding plumes were at their most beautiful at that time. When the adult birds were shot, the chicks, which depended entirely on their parents for food, starved to death in the nest. The death toll from the industry was thus multiplied far beyond the number of birds actually shot and processed. The campaign against the feather trade was one of the most successful environmental reform movements of the Victorian era, and it was largely led by women. This is historically significant and somewhat ironic. The women who wore feathered hats were also, in substantial numbers, the women who organized to end the killing that supplied the trade. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, founded in 1889, grew out of a campaign begun in Didsbury, near Manchester, by a group of women who were horrified by what they knew of the feather trade. These women took a personal stand. They pledged not to wear feathers, and they organized others to take the same pledge. They lobbied Parliament. They publicized the conditions under which the birds were killed, particularly the killing of breeding egrets with their dependent chicks. They campaigned in the press. The RSPB grew rapidly and eventually achieved legislative success. The Importation of Plumage Prohibition Act was passed in 1921 after decades of campaigning, banning the import of most wild bird feathers into Britain. By that time, the worst of the Victorian-era feather trade had already declined significantly, partly because of the campaigning and partly because fashion itself had moved on. The enormous, elaborate hats of the 1880s and 1890s gave way to smaller, simpler styles in the Edwardian era, and then to the minimal millinery of the 1920s. But the damage done in the decades of the trade's peak was real and lasting. Some populations of egrets and other birds that had been heavily targeted never fully recovered. The ecosystem disruption caused by the removal of large numbers of birds from their natural habitats had effects that cascaded through food webs and ecological communities in ways that took decades to become apparent. Victorian fashion did not only harm people, it reshaped the natural world. The connection between fashion and the natural world was not limited to feathers. Furs were another significant element of the Victorian fashion industry, and the fur trade, which predated the Victorian era by centuries, of course, was given new impetus by Victorian demand. Seal furs from the North Atlantic, sable from Russia, beaver from North America, where the fur trade had already dramatically reduced beaver populations over the previous 2 centuries, chinchilla from South America. The list is long. Animal skins for leather, beyond the standard cattle hides used in most leather production, also included exotic species: crocodile skin, snake skin, the skins of various big cats. These were not major components of the trade in volume terms, but they were significant in the damage they did to specific populations of animals in specific places. The ivory trade, while not strictly a fashion story, intersected with fashion in the Victorian era through buttons, handles, combs, and decorative objects. Elephant ivory was used for all of these things, and the demand it represented contributed to the killing of African elephants in quantities that, by the late Victorian era, were beginning to alarm some observers. Victorian fashion was a hunger that extended beyond the human world. It consumed not only human labor and human health, but the bodies of animals and the health of ecosystems, in a way that we are still, as a species, working to understand and to address. Chapter 9. The laundry, soap and soda, and the women who wash the beautiful things. And as the night deepens, and we move deeper into this world of fashion and its shadows, let us talk about something that is often overlooked when we discuss Victorian clothes: what happened after they were worn. Victorian clothing required maintenance on a scale that is difficult to comprehend from the perspective of the modern laundry room. A middle-class Victorian household would generate substantial quantities of washing every week, not just the obvious items of clothing and bed linen, but the intricate, delicate pieces of Victorian dress, the white collars and cuffs and frills, the petticoats, the fine cotton chemises, the silk neckerchiefs. All of these needed to be washed, dried, starched, and ironed, processes that were, before the mechanization of laundry in the early 20th century, profoundly labor-intensive. The laundry work was done in middle and upper-class households by laundresses, sometimes live-in servants, sometimes women who came weekly to do the wash. In working-class households, the laundry was done by the women of the household themselves. And in the cities, there were commercial laundries, large establishments that processed the washing of many households simultaneously. The physical labor of Victorian laundry was extraordinary. It involved lifting and carrying heavy loads of wet cloth, which weighs a great deal. It involved working for hours over large tubs of hot water in steam and heat. It involved the use of strong chemicals, washing soda, borax, bleaching agents, the harsh soaps of the era. It involved the iron, the heavy, solid metal implement heated directly on a hot stove and used to press garments and linens, a tool that had to be managed with some skill to avoid scorching delicate fabrics or burning oneself. The laundresses who worked in commercial laundries worked in conditions that were among the most physically demanding in any service trade. The heat was intense. Large boiler rooms heated water to temperatures that made the workrooms oppressively hot, particularly in summer. The steam created a persistent damp that soaked clothing and skin. The lifting and carrying produced musculoskeletal strain of the same kind, though with different specific patterns that affected dressmakers and seamstresses. The chemicals of the laundry were also not without hazard. Washing soda, sodium carbonate, is caustic enough to cause skin irritation with chronic exposure. The bleaching agents used to restore white fabrics to their pristine Victorian ideal, various chlorine compounds, in the later Victorian era, following the wider use of chlorine as a bleach in industrial and domestic contexts, could cause irritation to the respiratory tract when inhaled and to the skin on contact. The starching process, which was essential for the production of the rigid white collars and cuffs that were the hallmark of Victorian masculine respectability, involved immersing the fabric in a solution of starch made from wheat or rice, and then pressing it while damp. The finished product was a stiff, smooth surface that held its shape well, but that, when worn against the skin, could cause chafing and irritation, particularly on the neck where collar and skin were in constant contact. The ideal of white in Victorian fashion deserves a brief discussion because it was a powerful ideal with specific implications. White symbolized purity, cleanliness, and a very particular kind of virtue in the Victorian imagination. White collars, white cuffs, white shirts for men, white gowns and white undergarments for women, white christening clothes for babies, white wedding dresses. The color was pervasive and freighted with moral significance. To be clean, to be visibly clean, was to be respectable. To wear white and keep it white was to display a certain standard of living, the ability to maintain cleanliness, to employ servants who could do the laundry, to have access to the chemicals and the equipment needed to keep white things white. For working-class people, maintaining the ideal of white was a significant burden. It required time, labor, and money that were all in short supply. The laundry day that consumed much of a working-class woman's Monday every week, carrying water, heating it, washing, wringing, hanging, ironing, was not a small task. It was a substantial chunk of the week's labor, done in addition to all the other domestic tasks that kept a household running. And the chemicals used to produce the visual ideal of whiteness were not kind to the hands that used them. Working women's hands, red, roughened, chapped by water and chemicals and cold, were the opposite of the fashionable female ideal, which was soft and white and smooth. The paradox is almost too neat. The labor of producing white things made the hands that did that labor anything but white. There is a woman I want to tell you about, a woman who does not have a name in the historical record, who appears only briefly in a survey of London working women conducted in the 1880s by a social investigator named Charles Booth, who was conducting his monumental survey of London poverty. eventually published as Life and Labor of the People in London, 17 volumes of painstaking social observation. She is described only as a laundress of 43, living in Lambeth, working in a commercial laundry on the south bank of the Thames. She earns, the survey records, about 9 shillings a week during the busy season, less in the slack months. She has 2 children who do not yet work. She is, the investigator notes, severely arthritic in both hands. Her knuckles are enlarged and painful, and she has difficulty fully straightening her fingers in cold weather. She tells the investigator that she has been in laundry work since she was 14 years old, 29 years. She has no savings. She does not know what she will do when her hands become too bad to work. She is, the investigator observes, still cheerful and appears to take pride in the quality of her work. She has a name in the census returns if we could find them. She was a person with children and a life and 29 years of skill in a difficult trade. She appears in these 2 paragraphs of a Victorian social survey, and then she disappears from the historical record, as most people do. I have told you about her because I think it is important to hold specific, individual people in our minds as we go through this story. The statistics, the 1,000 deaths from crinoline fires, the millions of birds killed for the feather trade, can become abstract in ways that individual lives do not. She was a person. She was arthritic and cheerful and 43 years old. She ironed the beautiful shirts of people who never knew her name. The rubber and the GUTTAPERCHA, new materials and new dangers, and now let us follow the Victorians into a new kind of danger, the danger of innovation. Because the Victorian era was not only an era of tradition and established practices. It was also an era of remarkable material innovation, and some of those innovations brought new hazards alongside their new possibilities. Rubber was one of these. Natural rubber, derived from the latex of the Hevea brasiliensis tree, native to South America, had been known to Europeans since the 16th century, but it was not commercially useful until the early 19th century. Its problem was its behavior with temperature. In cold weather, it became stiff and brittle. In heat, it became soft and sticky. It was not a reliable material. Charles Goodyear, an American inventor, solved this problem in 1839 by developing the vulcanization process, treating rubber with sulfur under heat to produce a material that was stable across a wide range of temperatures, flexible, durable, and waterproof. Vulcanized rubber was a revolution. And it found its way into fashion almost immediately. Rubber elastic was used in the waistbands of garments, in the gussets of boots and shoes, in waterproof cloaks and overcoats. The elastic-sided boot, Chelsea boot, as we might call it today, became a staple of mid-Victorian footwear for both men and women, made possible by the incorporation of rubber elastic panels in the sides. The rubber itself was produced in the Amazon basin, where the wild hevea trees grew. And its production, particularly after the rubber boom of the late 19th century, created enormous international demand, was associated with one of the worst examples of colonial exploitation in the Victorian era. The rubber tappers of the Amazon, many of them indigenous people, were subjected to conditions of forced labor and brutal coercion by rubber traders and estate operators. This was not a comfortable or obscure fact in the Victorian period. It was exposed by the journalist Roger Casement and others in the early 20th century, causing international outrage. But the link between the rubber in Victorian boots and the suffering of the people who produced it was, like so many links in the fashion supply chain, invisible to the people who wore the boots. Gutta percha was another new material with fashion applications. It is a natural thermoplastic. It softens when heated and hardens when cooled, derived from the sap of a Malaysian tree. It was used in jewelry, in buttons, in decorative moldings for clothing, and in electrical insulation. It made transatlantic telegraph cables possible. It was also used in dentistry, in golf ball covers, and in a dozen other Victorian applications. Its harvesting involved cutting down the gutta percha trees to extract the sap, which was wasteful to the point of ecological destruction. The trees took decades to grow and were killed in the process of harvest. By the late 19th century, wild gutta percha trees were becoming scarce in their native range. Celluloid, which we mentioned earlier in the context of buttons and collars, was developed in the late 1860s as the first synthetic plastic. It was made from cellulose, derived from plant matter, treated with nitric acid to produce nitrocellulose, which was then plasticized with camphor. It could be molded, pressed, and formed into almost any shape. It was used for shirt collars and cuffs, the detachable collar being a Victorian invention of considerable social importance, allowing the appearance of a clean collar without the need to launder the whole shirt, and for combs, brushes, and costume jewelry. The flammability of celluloid was, as we have already noted, a real hazard. But there was another, less dramatic hazard associated with early celluloid production: the chemicals used in its manufacture. Nitric acid and sulfuric acid, used in the nitration of cellulose, are corrosive and dangerous. The camphor used as a plasticizer is toxic in large quantities and irritating in smaller ones. The workers in early celluloid factories were exposed to these substances in conditions that were, by the standards of the time, largely unregulated. The late Victorian era also saw the introduction of the first synthetic fibers, not in the dramatic form we know today, but in early imperfect versions. Artificial silk, what would eventually become rayon or viscose, was developed in the 1880s by Hilaire de Chardonnat, a French chemist who had been a student of Louis Pasteur's. Chardonnat's artificial silk was made from cellulose, treated with nitric acid to make nitrocellulose, then dissolved in a solvent and extruded through fine holes to produce fibers. These fibers could be woven into fabric that had the sheen of silk at a fraction of the cost. There was one considerable problem. The solvent used in the process was ether and alcohol, and the nitrocellulose solution, which was essentially liquid guncotton, was highly flammable. Chardonnat's factories had a habit of exploding. There were fires and accidents during the early decades of artificial silk production that killed and injured workers. The process was eventually improved. The carbon disulfide viscose process, which replaced the nitrocellulose with a cellulose xanthate solution, was safer in terms of flammability, though carbon disulfide itself is a dangerous chemical, toxic, and highly flammable. But the early history of artificial fiber production was marked by industrial accidents that were a direct consequence of using dangerous materials in imperfect conditions. There is something almost poignant about the Victorian drive toward artificial materials. It was driven, in part, by a genuine desire to make beautiful things more widely available. Artificial silk cost a fraction of the real thing. Celluloid buttons and collars were cheaper than ivory or bone. Rubber waterproofing made comfortable waterproof garments accessible to people who could never have afforded the traditional alternatives. The democratization of fashion, the possibility that everyone, not just the wealthy, might have access to beautiful and well-made clothing, was a real aspiration, driven by genuine technological innovation. And the hazards that came with that democratization were, in most cases, not immediately apparent. You cannot blame Chardonnat for not knowing, in 1884, that his nitrocellulose factory was dangerous in ways he had not fully mapped. The knowledge was not available. The understanding of occupational health, of materials science, of the chemistry of the body's response to toxic exposures, all of this was developing rapidly in the late 19th century, but it was developing from a position of very limited prior knowledge. What you can say is that when the hazards became apparent, when the factories started exploding, when the workers started dying, when the environmental damage became visible, the response was not always as rapid or as decisive as it might have been. Economic interests, once established, tend to resist the kinds of changes that threaten them, and this resistance delayed the implementation of safer practices long after safer practices were known to exist. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout the history of industrial production in the Victorian era and well beyond it. The doctors and the dyeing, medicine in the fashion trades, and as we settle deeper into this long night, let us talk about the doctors. Not the reformers, we have talked about them already, but the ordinary practitioners, the general physicians and surgeons and apothecaries who saw, in their daily rounds, the physical consequences of Victorian fashion on the bodies of their patients. These physicians were in an interesting position. They were witnesses to the damage. They saw the dressmakers with their failing eyes and their stooped spines. They saw the hatters with their tremors and their erratic behavior. They saw the women who presented with the classic signs of chronic arsenic poisoning, the darkened skin, the peripheral neuropathy, the digestive disturbances, and tried to understand what was making them ill. They saw the complications of tight lacing, the misplaced organs, the fractured ribs, the chronic digestive problems. What they did with what they saw was constrained by the medicine of the era. Victorian medicine was undergoing one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of the discipline, the germ theory revolution, the development of antiseptic surgery, the beginnings of what would become modern pharmacology. But it was still, in many ways, limited in its ability to diagnose, explain, or treat occupational illness. The concept of occupational disease was not new. The Italian physician Bernardino Rumezzini had written extensively about it in 1700, in a book called De Morbis Artificum Diatriba, a careful account of the diseases associated with dozens of different trades. But Rumezzini's work had been partially forgotten, and Victorian medicine was not always good at connecting symptoms to causes, particularly when the cause was something in the patient's working environment rather than something in the patient's body. The germ theory revolution of the 1860s and 1870s actually complicated this in some ways. As the microbial causes of many diseases became clear, as it became understood that tuberculosis was caused by a specific bacterium, that cholera was waterborne, that wound infections were caused by microorganisms, there was a tendency to look for microbial explanations for conditions that were actually caused by toxic chemical exposures. The concept of occupational toxicity, of the workplace as a source of chemical harm, was slower to develop a clear scientific framework than the concept of infectious disease. This meant that Victorian physicians looking at a hatter with tremors or a flower maker with peripheral neuropathy were often not equipped to diagnose the mercury or arsenic poisoning that was responsible. They might attribute the symptoms to overwork, to poor diet, to the general debility of poverty, to nervous exhaustion, all of which may have been contributing factors, making the correct diagnosis even harder to reach. There were exceptions. There were physicians who were sufficiently curious and sufficiently systematic to make the connections that their contemporaries were missing. A physician named Thomas Oliver, working in Newcastle in the 1890s and early 1900s, became one of the leading experts on occupational disease in Britain. He wrote extensively about lead poisoning, a hazard in the pottery and paint trades, not directly in fashion but close enough to be relevant, and about mercury poisoning in the hat trade. He was methodical, observant, and willing to pursue the uncomfortable conclusion that it was people's jobs that were killing them, which in the economic climate of late Victorian Britain was not always a welcome message. Oliver's work was part of a broader movement in medical science, occupational medicine, or industrial medicine that eventually produced the specialized discipline we have today. The path from Ramazzini in 1700 to modern occupational health was long and winding, and it passed through the Victorian era with its particular constellation of industrial hazards. Surgery of the Victorian era also intersected with fashion in specific ways, though perhaps not in ways that are immediately obvious. The development of anesthesia in the 1840s, ether in America, chloroform in Britain, transformed surgery from a procedure that had to be performed as quickly as possible on a conscious, struggling patient to something that could be done carefully and thoroughly on an unconscious one. This was one of the great revolutions in medicine. The subsequent development of antiseptic technique by Joseph Lister in the 1860s transformed surgery again, by making it possible to perform operations without the catastrophic mortality from post-operative infection that had made even successful operations often fatal. These developments intersected with Victorian fashion in the specific context of injuries. The seamstress who caught her hand in machinery, the factory girl burned in a crinoline fire, the hatter whose tremor made him vulnerable to accidents, the button cutter who lost a finger to a poorly guarded machine. All of these people, when they came to hospital in the post-anesthesia, post-antiseptic era, had a better chance of surgical survival than they would have had a generation earlier. But surgical care was still limited in its reach. Hospital care was expensive, and working-class patients often avoided it until absolutely necessary, partly from the very reasonable fear, still somewhat justified even in the post-Listerian era, that going to hospital was likely to make you worse rather than better. The cottage hospitals that began to spread in the later Victorian era were more accessible, but they were not comprehensive. Workers with occupational illnesses, chronic conditions that were not amenable to surgery in any case, often received no treatment at all beyond the advice of a local apothecary, or in later decades, a general practitioner operating under the rudimentary system that existed before the National Insurance Act of 1911. The relationship between Victorian physicians and Victorian women was a subject of significant complexity. The male medical establishment of the era held views about women's physiology and psychology that were, by modern standards, extraordinary in their combination of confidence and error. The doctrine of the wandering womb, the idea that the uterus was a powerful internal organ whose state had profound effects on a woman's mental and physical health, was not exactly new, having roots in ancient Greek medicine, but it was given new pseudo-scientific clothing in the Victorian era. The theory of hysteria, a condition attributed almost exclusively to women and attributed specifically to disturbances of the uterus, was used to explain an enormous range of female symptoms and behaviors. Fainting, emotional volatility, headaches, nervousness, inexplicable physical pains, all could be attributed to hysteria, which functioned as a kind of diagnostic wastebasket into which symptoms that physicians could not explain were deposited. The consequence of this was that many women presenting to Victorian physicians with genuine occupational illness, the dressmaker with peripheral neuropathy from arsenic exposure, the corset-wearing woman with genuine organ displacement, the laundress with repetitive strain injury, had their symptoms attributed to hysteria or to some other form of nervous delicacy, rather than to the physical causes that actually produced them. This diagnostic failure was not neutral. It meant that real causes of real suffering were not identified, not treated, and not challenged. It meant that the industries producing those causes continued to operate without accountability for the harm they were doing. It meant that the women themselves were told, in effect, that the problem was in their heads, when in fact the problem was in their hands, or in their lungs, or in the arsenic-dyed flowers they handled every day. Across the water, fashion's global reach, the fashion industry of the Victorian era, was not confined to Britain. It was a global industry in the sense that the raw materials came from around the world, and the influence of British and French fashion spread around the world with the spread of European trade and colonialism. Let us look at some of these global connections, because they are part of the full picture of Victorian fashion's shadows. The cotton that fed the British mills came from America, as we have discussed, picked by enslaved people before the Civil War and by sharecroppers and tenant farmers, many of them formerly enslaved, after it. The American cotton economy was restructured by the end of slavery, but not dismantled. The same land, the same labor, the same systems of debt and control continued to produce cotton for British and American mills through the second half of the 19th century, under conditions that were shaped by the legacy of slavery, even when they were not formally slavery itself. Indigo, the deep blue dye used in cotton fabric, in denim, in countless other textile applications, came predominantly from India during the Victorian era, where it was grown under a system of forced cultivation that the British colonial administration imposed on peasant farmers in Bengal. The indigo planters, mostly British, required local farmers to grow indigo on a proportion of their land, at prices set by the planters, regardless of whether the farmers wanted to grow it or whether the economics of indigo cultivation made sense for them. The farmers who resisted this system, and many did in the Indigo Revolt of 1859-60, one of the largest peasant uprisings in Indian history, were subjected to violence, legal manipulation, and eviction. The blue of your Victorian dress, then, had a shadow that extended to Bengal, to farmers who had no choice about growing the plant that produced it. Jute, used for the coarse canvas and burlap that backed carpets, lined the insides of coats, provided the structural layers beneath the decorative surfaces of Victorian fashion, came from the mills of Dundee in Scotland, which processed jute from Bengal. The mills of Dundee employed thousands of workers, predominantly women, in conditions that were parallel to those of the cotton mills, loud, dusty, prone to producing respiratory illness in the workforce. The Silk Roads of the Victorian era are perhaps less well known than the historical Silk Road, but they were real and important. Silk came from China and Japan, from the silk-producing regions around Lyon and other parts of France from Italy. The opening of Japan to Western trade in the 1850s, under American pressure, created a new source of Japanese silk and Japanese textile art that influenced Western fashion significantly. The aesthetic movement of the 1870s and 1880s, which is associated in fashion with loose, flowing garments in Japanese-influenced designs, and which was a conscious response to the rigidity of conventional Victorian fashion, drew heavily on Japanese textiles and Japanese design principles. The trade in Japanese goods that fueled this aesthetic movement was something of a mixed blessing for Japan itself. The rapid opening of the Japanese economy to Western trade caused economic disruption of a significant kind. The traditional textile industries of Japan, organized around guild systems and traditional techniques, were disrupted by the demand for mass production of goods for export. The balance of economic power between Japan and the Western trading nations was profoundly unequal in the 1850s and 1860s, though this began to change as Japan industrialized rapidly under the Meiji government. Cashmere, the fine, warm wool from the undercoat of the cashmere goat, used in the finest Victorian shawls and garments, came from the Kashmir region of northern India, where goats were herded on the high Himalayan plateau. The cashmere shawl was one of the most prized items of luxury in the Victorian wardrobe, and the demand for it was so strong that it inspired European imitations: the Paisley shawl from Scotland, the jacquard woven shawls from Lyon that reproduced the patterns of the original at a fraction of the cost. The goat herders of Kashmir who produced the raw fiber were remote from the drawing rooms of London where the finished shawls were worn. The economic chains connecting them were long and mediated by many intermediaries, and the rewards that reached them for the extraordinary quality of their animals' fiber were small compared to the value of the finished product. The rubber story extends further into this global network. The Amazon rubber tappers who worked under coercive conditions to supply the Victorian rubber boom were, as we have mentioned, indigenous people in many cases, or mixed-race people of the Brazilian interior, working within a system of debt peonage, the aviamento system, that bound them to specific employers through cycles of debt that were in practice impossible to escape. The Congo rubber atrocities of the 1890s and 1900s, associated with the exploitation of the Belgian Congo rubber trade under King Leopold II, are too large a story for this script to contain in full, but the connection to fashion is real. The rubber used in Victorian waterproof garments, in elastic fabrics, in rubber-soled shoes, came from a global trade in which the interests of the producers were consistently subordinated to the interests of the consumers, and in which the violence used to enforce that subordination was, in the Congo case, documented with horrifying precision. This is the global shadow of Victorian fashion. A shadow that extended to every continent from which it drew its raw materials, leaving marks that are, in some cases, still visible today in the economic and social structures of those places. The department stores and the birth of shopping, and as the night settles and deepens around us, let us walk through a very different kind of space. Let us walk through a department store. The Victorian department store was one of the great innovations of the era, and it has a direct connection to the story of fashion and fashion's dangers. because it was the department store that, more than any other single institution, began to change the relationship between ordinary people and fashionable clothing. Before the department store, before Bon Marché in Paris, opened in its modern form in 1852, before Harrods, before Selfridges, before the great American department stores of the 1870s and 1880s, buying clothes was a different kind of transaction. You went to a draper for fabric, to a dressmaker for garments, to a bootmaker for shoes. Each was a separate expedition to a specialized shop. The shopping was practical, purposive, intentional. The department store changed this. It gathered many different kinds of goods under one roof. It created a space that was designed not just to sell things, but to be beautiful in itself, to be a place where spending time was pleasurable, where looking was part of the experience. The great Victorian department stores had soaring glass-roofed atriums, miles of polished wood counters, gas lamps in elaborate fittings, lifts, elevators that were novelties in themselves. They were destinations. And they had, from the beginning, a complex and sometimes difficult relationship with the people who worked in them. The shop assistants of the Victorian department store, the young women who stood behind the counters for 10 or 12 hours a day, who were expected to be pleasant and helpful and well-dressed and knowledgeable about the goods they sold, worked under conditions that were in some ways better than those of the dressmakers and factory workers we have discussed, and in other ways comparable. The better aspects, they were in a heated, lit environment. They were paid a modest wage. In many stores, they were housed in dormitories attached to or near the store, which, while not luxurious, provided at least a roof. They were not doing physically brutal labor in the sense of lifting heavy loads or working with dangerous machinery. The more difficult aspects, the standing, the hours, the discipline. Victorian department stores were managed with a kind of military precision that would strike modern employees as extreme. Shop assistants were expected to stand throughout their shift. Sitting, even when no customers were present, was not permitted in many stores. They were expected to speak and dress within strictly defined parameters. They were subjected to fines for minor infractions, speaking too loudly, failing to maintain correct posture, breaking a displayed item, being a few minutes late. Their private lives were regulated. In stores that housed their employees, curfews were common, male visitors were prohibited, and correspondence could be monitored. The standing was the most direct physical problem. 10 or 12 hours of continuous standing produces specific musculoskeletal effects. Varicose veins, the blood pools in the legs when the calf muscles are not actively working, lower back pain, knee pain, foot problems. These were common complaints among shop assistants and were documented by the physicians who worked in areas with high concentrations of shop workers. The campaign for seats for shop assistants, literally, for the right to sit down when not actively serving customers, was one of the reform campaigns of the late Victorian era. It was associated with activists who argued that the standing requirement was physically harmful and served no purpose beyond the desire of management to maintain an appearance of busy efficiency. The campaign succeeded eventually in obtaining legal protection. The Shop Hours Act required rest periods. The Seats for Assistants legislation required seats, but the change came over decades, not overnight. The department store also changed the nature of fashion itself in ways that are directly relevant to our story. Before the department store, and more broadly before the development of ready-made clothing in the mid-Victorian era, most clothing was either made at home by the women of the household or made to order by a dressmaker or tailor. It was fitted to the specific body it was intended for. It was, within the constraints of fashion, somewhat individual. Ready-made clothing produced in standard sizes and sold off the rack, changed this. It made fashionable clothing available at lower prices and faster than made to measure. But it also introduced a new set of pressures. Ready-made clothing was made to standard sizes, and the standard sizes of the Victorian era, like those of most eras, were based on an idealized body that many actual bodies did not conform to. Too tall, too short, too broad in the shoulder, too narrow in the hip, real bodies deviated from the standard in all directions. The pressure to conform to the standard size, to squeeze or pad or lace the body into the shape that the ready-made garment assumed, was, in a sense, a new version of the old pressure to achieve the fashionable ideal. Now the ideal was not just an aesthetic aspiration, but a practical necessity. The dress that fit the fashion mannequin might only be obtainable if you were shaped like the fashion mannequin. And the fashion mannequin, as an actual physical object, the tailor's dummy, the dress form, was itself a projection of an ideal that was shaped by fashion rather than by the natural distribution of human body shapes. The waist was nipped. The hip was full but correctly placed. The bust was at the right height and the right projection. The idealized woman encoded in the dress form was the same idealized woman encoded in the fashion illustration, in the fashion plate, in the magazine article about the correct silhouette for the season. Let us pause here, in this department store, in this long Victorian evening. We have walked a very long way through the Victorian fashion world. We have been to the cotton mills and the silk workshops and the dye factories. We have been to the dressmakers' workrooms and the hat-making shops and the feather warehouses. We have been to the parlors where women laced their corsets and the ballrooms where they fainted from the compression of them. We have been to the laundries and the department stores and the reform meetings. And through all of it, we have been tracing a single thread, the thread of danger, of harm, of cost, the cost of beauty, the cost of fashion. It is not a comfortable thread to hold. It is not a simple story of villains and victims. It is a complex story of a society that was, in many ways, genuinely trying to improve itself. The reformers were real. The reforms were real. The medical understanding was developing. The legal protections were coming. But that was doing so slowly, against the resistance of economic interest and cultural inertia, in a world that did not yet have the conceptual tools to understand the full scope of what was happening. The Victorians who knew about the arsenic in the dye and did nothing were not, in most cases, deliberately choosing harm over profit. They were operating within a framework of understanding in which the evidence was contested, the mechanisms were unclear, and the economic argument for action was not yet compelling. This does not make their choices right, but it makes them comprehensible in a way that matters if we want to understand the past rather than simply condemn it. And understanding the past, I think, is what we are here to do. The night shift, what history remembers and what it forgets, and as the night deepens, let us talk about memory, about what history has kept and what it has let go. The Victorians we remember are, in the main, the wealthy ones, the aristocrats, the industrialists, the politicians, the writers and artists, the scientists and inventors. We remember them because they left records, letters, diaries, published works, painted portraits, photographs. The seamstress who went blind from sewing by candlelight left almost nothing. Her name might appear in a census return, in a parish register, in the testimony of a parliamentary inquiry, but she did not write a memoir. She did not leave a portrait. She is in the historical record only as data, a data point in a survey, a name in a list, a brief description in a social investigator's notebook. This asymmetry of the historical record is not a neutral fact. It shapes what we know and what we think we know about the past. It makes the lives of the wealthy and the powerful more vivid and more detailed than the lives of the poor and the invisible. It gives us a past populated mainly by the exceptions, the people who survived, who succeeded, who left enough traces for historians to find, rather than by the vast majority, who lived and worked and suffered and died and left very little. The history of fashion is particularly subject to this asymmetry. The clothing that has survived from the Victorian era, the clothing in museum collections, the clothing in theatrical collections, the clothing that appears in photographs and illustrations, is overwhelmingly the clothing of the wealthy. Fine silk gowns with hand-embroidered bodices, exquisitely tailored men's coats, perfectly preserved bonnets of velvet and lace. The clothing of the poor has almost entirely not survived. It was worn out, mended, remended, repurposed, cut down to fit smaller people, ultimately reduced to rags and used for cleaning or for paper milling. The working dress of the Victorian seamstress, the plain wool skirt of the laundress, the coarse linen smock of the factory hand, these are gone. We have no objects to hold, no material evidence of the daily dress of the majority of Victorian people. This means that when we think about Victorian fashion, we are mostly thinking about an extreme. The high fashion of the era, the crinoline and the bustle and the tight laced corset, was mostly worn by a relatively small number of women at the top of the social hierarchy. The majority of Victorian women wore something considerably more modest, a practical, functional outfit that allowed them to do their work, that was not kept up with the latest fashion because they could not afford to, that represented not an aesthetic statement, but simply what they wore. And yet the dangers we have discussed, the arsenic dyes, the corset, the tuberculosis of the workroom, were not confined to the wealthy. They touched people at every level of the social hierarchy in different ways and to different degrees. The wealthy woman's arsenic-dyed gloves, the flower maker's arsenic-dyed flowers, the mill worker's cotton dust, the laundress's chapped and chemically burnt hands. Different dangers, different proximities, but the same industry, the same fashion system, the same thread running through all of them. I want to tell you one more story before we begin to wind down, a story that brings together several of the threads we have been following. Her name was Lizzie Sherwell, and she is one of the very few working-class Victorian women about whom we have more than a line or two of historical information, and that is because her case came to the attention of a parliamentary committee and was recorded in its minutes. Lizzie was a dressmaker's assistant in London in the early 1860s. She was, when the committee heard about her, about 22 years old. She had been apprenticed to a dressmaking establishment in the West End when she was 14, and she had worked there for 8 years. She had, in those 8 years, experienced the full range of conditions we have been describing, the long hours in the season, the nights without sleep, the poor food, the eye strain, the crowded dormitory, the recycled air. By the time she was 22, she had developed tuberculosis. She was thin, pale, and had a persistent cough. She had also developed significant eye problems. Her vision had deteriorated to the point that she could no longer do the fine, close work that was the core of her trade. She was, in effect, unemployable in the only trade she knew at the age of 22. She told the parliamentary committee about her work. She described the hours. She described the dormitory, 16 girls in a room that was meant for 6, in bunk beds stacked too high with one small window. She described the food, bread and butter in the morning, a small portion of meat and vegetables at midday, bread and tea in the evening. On the long nights, nothing extra, sometimes a cup of hot water if they were lucky. She did not complain. That is what is striking about her testimony, reading it now. She described the conditions matter-of-factly, as if they were simply the way things were, as if any other arrangement would have been surprising. She had been working in this way since she was 14. It was the only life she knew. The committee member who questioned her asked whether she thought the conditions were good or bad. She paused. The pause is recorded in the transcript. And then she said that she supposed they were about the same as in other establishments. About the same as in other establishments. The conditions that were making her ill, that had damaged her eyes and filled her lungs with disease, were, as far as she knew, normal. The baseline against which she measured them was the same standard that was making other girls ill in other establishments all over London. The committee member asked if she knew any girls who had been in better health when they started than they were now. She looked around at the room, the transcript notes, as if the question surprised her. Then she said, most of them. The end of the Victorian era, and what came after the Victorian era ended in 1901 with the death of Queen Victoria in January. She was 81 years old and had been queen for 63 years. The world she left behind was vastly different from the world she had come to rule in 1837, different in almost every way, including, though this is rarely mentioned in the obituaries and retrospectives, in the area of fashion. By 1901, Victorian fashion, as we have been describing it, was already giving way. The massive skirts of the crinoline era were long gone. The bustle had come and gone twice. The fashionable silhouette of the late 1890s was the hourglass, a very full skirt from the hips downward, paired with a high-necked, tight-bodiced upper half, and the enormous leg-of-mutton sleeves that characterized the decade, sleeves so wide at the shoulder that they gave the wearer the appearance of trying to take flight. The corset of 1901 was different from the corset of 1850. It was longer, extending further down over the hips, and it had the characteristic curve that pushed the bust forward and the hips back, producing the S-curve silhouette associated with the Edwardian era that was just beginning. This was, by some measures, slightly less compressive than the tight, laced corset of the mid-Victorian era, or at least differently compressive, but it was still a rigid, constrictive garment worn against the body for many hours of every day. The arsenic in the dyes was declining, but not gone. The feather trade was being campaigned against, but still operating at scale. The conditions in dressmaking workshops had improved somewhat, but were still far from what we would consider acceptable. The department store had become a fixture of urban life, bringing new commercial possibilities and new commercial pressures. The ready-made clothing industry was expanding, with all the implications for standard sizing and body conformity that we have discussed. In 1901, there were still cotton mills producing fabric in Lancashire and Yorkshire. There were still silk weavers, still hatters, still artificial flower makers. The industry was changing, the technology was developing, the legal framework was evolving, the labor movement was organizing, but it had not been transformed overnight. The Edwardian era that followed was, in fashion terms, both a continuation and a beginning of something new. The corset continued, but so did the campaign against it. The first signs of the fashion revolution that would produce the 1920s, the dropped waists, the shorter skirts, the rejection of rigid structure, were beginning to become visible in the work of designers like Paul Poiret in Paris, who was advocating for unstructured garments and would eventually declare the death of the corset. The corset did not die in 1907, as Poart declared. It adapted. It became the brassiere and the girdle. The pressure on the female body did not disappear with the corset. It relocated, and it changed its character, but the fundamental dynamic fashion defining an ideal shape and women's bodies being modified, sometimes at significant cost, to achieve it persisted. The occupational diseases of the textile trades persisted too, though the specific contours changed as the technology changed. Cotton dust remained a problem until well into the 20th century. Bisonosis was not eliminated from British mills until the mills largely closed. Mercury in hat making persisted in some parts of the trade until the mid-20th century. The United States did not ban the use of mercury in felt processing until 1941. The feather trade declined precipitously after the First World War, partly because of the legislation that the RSPB and its allies had worked for, and partly because the fashions of the 1920s simply did not include the elaborate feathered hats of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. And the people who had done the work, most of them left no record. They are the anonymous majority of the story, the ones who made the things, who wore them out, who lived and died in the industry without leaving any trace beyond a line in a census or a brief entry in a hospital record. The legacy, what we inherited and what we choose, and as the night grows very still and we approach the end of this long journey through the Victorian world, let us ask the question that is always implied by this kind of historical exploration. What does it mean for us? The direct hazards of Victorian fashion are, in many cases, behind us. Arsenic in fabric dyes is long gone. The most extreme forms of corsetry have given way to undergarments that, while still sometimes uncomfortable, do not displace internal organs. The feather trade operates under strict regulation. The working conditions in textile production in the developed world are, while still imperfect, incomparably better than those of a Victorian dressmaking workshop. But the supply chain of fashion still extends around the world. The clothes we buy today are, in most cases, made somewhere else, in Bangladesh, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in China, in Ethiopia, by workers whose wages and working conditions are determined by the economic pressures of the global fashion industry. When the Rana Plaza factory building in Dhaka, Bangladesh, collapsed in 2013, killing over 1,000 garment workers who had been producing clothes for Western fashion brands, it was a reminder that the distance between the person who wears the garment and the person who makes it does not eliminate the connection between them. The synthetic dyes used in today's fashion industry are largely, but not entirely, free of the most toxic compounds of the Victorian era. But synthetic dyes still require careful management of waste. The dye effluent from textile factories is still a significant source of water pollution in many parts of the world, particularly in countries where environmental regulation is weaker than in the producing nations. The corset has returned repeatedly as a fashion trend, as shapewear, as outerwear, as a cultural touchstone of a certain aesthetic. Each revival is accompanied by the same debate that accompanied it in the Victorian era, about beauty and constraint, about personal choice and social pressure, about the body and what it should look like and why. The debate is not resolved, and it probably cannot be resolved because it touches on questions that are genuinely complex and genuinely personal. The ideal of the fashionable body, the specific shape that fashion at any given moment declares to be correct, is still doing its work on people's self-perception and on the choices they make about their own bodies. The means of achieving the ideal change with technology. Corsetry gives way to shapewear, stays give way to surgery, tight lacing gives way to rigorous dieting. But the underlying logic, the body that does not naturally conform to the ideal, must be modified to approach it, persists. I am not saying this is wrong. I am saying it is old. I am saying that the conversations we are having now about fashion and beauty and bodies are conversations that the Victorians were having too, in different vocabulary and with different specific objects in hand, but with the same fundamental tensions at their core. The history of dress reform, the history of the people who looked at Victorian fashion and said, "This is not right, this is doing harm," is also a legacy that we have inherited. The rational dress movement, the public health reformers, the RSPB campaigners, the parliamentary committees, these were the ancestors of the modern conversations about ethical fashion, about slow fashion, about the politics of what we wear. They did not always win. They were often mocked, dismissed, caricatured, ignored. The changes they advocated took decades and sometimes generations to be implemented, but they made the arguments. They put on record in parliamentary testimony and in newspaper articles and in reform pamphlets and in the publications of learned societies the evidence of what was happening. They created the body of knowledge that eventually made change possible. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The history of progress is mostly the history of people who were told they were wrong or impractical or radical, who kept arguing anyway, who documented the problem and kept documenting it until someone was finally in a position to do something about it. We stand at the end of a very long thread that began somewhere in a cotton field or a silk workshop or a dye factory, and we are still, if we choose to be, part of that thread. The small details, buttons and hooks, and the intimacy of dressing, we have been thinking in large terms about industries and systems and global supply chains. Let us come back to something smaller, something more intimate. Let us come back to the act of getting dressed, because Victorian fashion was, in its daily reality, an intensely intimate and time-consuming process. The layers of a fashionable Victorian woman's dress, beginning from the skin and working outward, were remarkable in their complexity and in the degree to which they required assistance to put on and take off. The first layer was the shift or chemise, a simple linen or cotton garment worn directly against the skin, protecting the outer layers from body oils and perspiration. Over this came the drawers, close-fitting cotton or linen undergarments covering the legs. Then the corset, which required a second person to lace from behind. Then the corset cover, a simple layer worn over the corset to prevent the boning from chafing the inner garments. Then the petticoat, or more than one petticoat, their fullness and stiffening depending on the style of the era. Then finally the outer dress, which might consist of a separate bodice and skirt or of a one-piece construction. All of this was held together with hooks and eyes, with buttons, with laces, with pins, with ribbons. The number of fasteners involved in a fashionable Victorian woman's toilet, the complete process of dressing, was substantial. Large households employed a lady's maid specifically to assist with this process. Without assistance, getting into a fully fashionable Victorian outfit was difficult or impossible. This dependence on another person's hands to get dressed and undressed was not merely inconvenient. It was a structural feature of fashionable life that reinforced class distinctions in a very direct physical way. To dress fashionably, you needed a servant. To have a servant, you needed money. The fashionable dress was thus simultaneously a marker of status and a mechanism by which that status was maintained. You could not, literally, put it on without the assistance that only a certain kind of household could provide. The buttons of Victorian dress were made from many materials, as we have touched on: bone, shell, jet, glass, brass, celluloid, and for the finest garments, silver and gold and even precious stones. Button making was a specialized trade with its own geography. Birmingham was the center of British button manufacturing, producing millions of metal buttons of every description for domestic and export markets. The workers in the Birmingham button factories handled metals, lacquers, dyes, and presses in conditions that had their own occupational hazards. Shell buttons, made from the shells of freshwater mussels, of nautilus, of various mollusks, were produced in industrial quantities, particularly in the United States, where the industry centered on the Mississippi River basin. The shell was cut into blanks by mechanical saws and then shaped on lathes, producing enormous quantities of fine dust that the workers breathed. The nacre dust, the material of mother of pearl, caused a lung condition in workers exposed to large amounts of it over long periods. Even the button, even the small, pretty, innocuous button, even that was part of the shadow. Gloves deserve their own moment. We have already mentioned the green arsenic-dyed kid gloves. But gloves were a more pervasive presence in Victorian fashion than perhaps we fully appreciate. In Victorian social convention, a person, man or woman, appeared in public wearing gloves. To appear gloveless in a formal social context was, in many circumstances, a minor social impropriety. Gloves were worn to church, to dinner parties, to the opera, to calls, the formal social visits that structured upper and middle-class Victorian social life. A woman carried her gloves even when she was not wearing them, folded and held in the hand, as a sign of preparedness and propriety. The varieties of gloves in the Victorian era were considerable. Kid gloves made from the skin of young goats were the finest and most expensive, and these were the ones that might be dyed with arsenic compounds, as we have discussed. Cotton gloves were a more practical and less expensive alternative. Woolen gloves were worn in cold weather. Heavy leather work gloves were worn for domestic tasks. The making of kid gloves was a skilled trade. The skins were fine and delicate, and working with them required patience and precision. The glove makers, particularly those working in the glove-making towns of the English West Country, like Yeovil in Somerset, which was a major center of the English glove industry, were skilled craftspeople who typically worked in small workshops or at home. Their tools were simple: a knife for cutting, a stretching frame for shaping the skins, but their skill was considerable. The chemical processes used to prepare kid for glove making involved various tanning compounds, some of which were irritants. The dyes used, not only the green arsenic dyes but various other colorants, brought their own hazards. And the very fineness of the work, done by the same processes of close focused effort that we have already described in Seamstresses, meant that glove makers too were susceptible to the occupational eye problems of the precision needlework trades. The hat for men deserves a final moment of attention. We have talked about felt hats and the mercury used in their production, but the top hat, the defining accessory of Victorian masculinity, deserves its own consideration. The top hat was made from silk plush, not felt. The silk plush, a cut silk velvet with a very long, lustrous pile, was applied over a base of felt or stiffened buckram to produce the characteristic gleaming cylinder. The silk for the plush came from the weaving industry. The buckram base was a stiffened linen that had its own production processes. But the most interesting thing about the Victorian top hat, from our perspective tonight, is not its materials but its social function. The top hat was a marker of status so reliable, so immediate, so legible to any Victorian observer that a man's place in the social order could be read from the height, the quality, and the condition of his hat with remarkable accuracy. A high, gleaming, new top hat said one thing. A slightly less high, slightly less gleaming hat said another. A battered, disreputable top hat said something else entirely. The top hat was also, by any objective assessment, extremely inconvenient. It was heavy. It did not stay on the head securely in wind. It could not be stored easily when not in use. It required a special hat box, a hat stand, a space in the hallway. It was difficult to keep clean and in good condition, particularly in the smoke and soot of a Victorian industrial city. It was spectacularly impractical in any situation that required physical activity. It was worn anyway. For decades, it was worn by men of the middle and upper classes as a matter of absolute convention, because convention is more powerful than comfort, and fashion is more powerful than convenience. The men who wore it accepted its inconveniences as simply part of what wearing it meant, as the necessary price of the social legibility it provided. The hat stands, in this way, as a small metaphor for everything we have been discussing tonight: the price of beauty, the price of fashion. The price of fitting correctly into your world, of being read correctly by the people around you, of belonging to the group that wearing the right things allowed you to belong to. The price was sometimes small, and sometimes it was very large indeed. The perfume, scent, and its secrets, and as the candle burns lower and the hour grows very late, let us speak of one more aspect of Victorian fashion that we have not yet touched on. A subtle one, a sensory one: scent. The Victorians were very interested in perfume, and the perfumery of the Victorian era was both a high art, with great houses in Paris producing extraordinary fragrances that are still being remade and celebrated today, and a significant commercial industry producing scented waters and pomades and toilet waters for every level of the market. The raw materials of Victorian perfumery came from around the world. Musk from the Himalayan musk deer, a glandular secretion extracted often by killing the animal. Ambergris from the sperm whale, a waxy substance found in the intestines of sperm whales, sometimes washed ashore, sometimes extracted from killed animals. Civet from the civet cat, extracted from the perineal glands of captive animals, who were kept in small cages and stressed regularly to stimulate secretion. Castoreum from beavers. These animal-derived ingredients were the fixatives and the base notes of Victorian perfumery, the materials that gave perfumes their depth and longevity. They were used in small quantities, but their production required the exploitation or killing of the animals that produced them. The plant-derived ingredients were extracted from flowers, roots, barks, and resins from around the world: roses from Bulgaria and Turkey, jasmine from grass in France, vetiver from India, patchouli from Southeast Asia, sandalwood from India and Sri Lanka. The trade in these raw materials extended the reach of the perfume industry, like fashion more broadly, around the globe, and the economic relationships between the producing countries and the French and British perfumery houses that purchased their materials were, as in so many other commodity trades, profoundly unequal. The chemical solvents used to extract fragrant compounds from plant materials, benzene, in some processes, were toxic. Benzene is a carcinogen, and workers in industries using benzene as an extraction solvent were at elevated risk of leukemia and other blood cancers. This was not known in the Victorian era. The connection between benzene exposure and cancer was established only in the 20th century, but the exposure was occurring, and its consequences were real even if they were not understood. The finished perfumes themselves were applied to the skin in significant quantities by some users, and the compounds they contained, some of which we now know to be sensitizing, potentially carcinogenic, or otherwise problematic, were absorbed to some degree through the skin or inhaled from the air immediately around the wearer. Modern perfumery has developed synthetic alternatives to most of the animal-derived ingredients of the Victorian era: synthetic musk, synthetic ambergris, a whole vocabulary of synthetic aromatic compounds that have replaced the most problematic natural materials. But this replacement has brought its own issues. Synthetic musks, for example, have been found to bioaccumulate in human tissue and in aquatic ecosystems, and the long-term effects of this accumulation are still being studied. The scent of the past, like its fabric and its dye and its structure, was not without shadows. The photographer and the fashionable dead let us look at one more curious corner of the Victorian fashion world, one that intersects with another very Victorian preoccupation: death. The Victorians were, there is no gentle way to put this, very interested in death. Death was more present in Victorian life than it is in ours. The infant mortality rate was high. The adult mortality rate from infectious diseases was high. The life expectancy was significantly shorter. Death was a regular visitor to Victorian families, and the culture developed elaborate rituals for dealing with it. Mourning dress was one of these rituals. When a close relative died, a Victorian woman was expected to enter a period of formal mourning during which she wore specific types of clothing, dark colors, eventually black, made from specific materials, for a specified period of time that varied depending on her relationship to the deceased and the formality of her social circle. The regulations around mourning dress were intricate and unforgiving. There were women who dedicated significant portions of their lives to wearing mourning dress for one relative or another, as family members died in the normal procession of Victorian mortality. The materials specified for mourning dress were themselves problematic. Crepe, a particular kind of crimped, dull silk fabric that was specified for deep mourning, was made using a heat and chemical treatment process that gave it its characteristic texture. This process involved, in some formulations, chemicals that were irritating to the skin on direct contact. Women who wore crepe in direct contact with their skin reported rashes and skin irritation. The problem was well enough known that there was a recognized condition called crepe rash, associated specifically with the wearing of mourning crepe. The jet jewelry that accompanied mourning dress, jet being a form of fossilized wood from Whitby in Yorkshire, carved into beads and brooches and bracelets, was carved by workers who breathed jet dust, a fine black powder that was an occupational hazard in the Whitby jet carving trade, and the dyes used to achieve the deep, unmodulated black required for Victorian mourning dress were their own story. True black dye is technically challenging. Achieving a uniform, deep, light, fast black on fabric requires multiple dyeing processes and the use of mordants and fixing compounds that are not always without hazard. The black dyes of the Victorian era used various compounds, and some of the workers in the dyeing trade who worked specifically with black dyes were exposed to concentrated chemical environments. Even in grief, even in the expression of loss, the Victorian fashion system left its marks on the people who worked within it. The mourning portrait, the Victorian photograph taken of a recently deceased person, is a related phenomenon that sometimes involved fashion in a specific and unsettling way. It was common in the Victorian era, when photography was still new and still expensive, to have a photograph taken of a person who had just died as a memorial, sometimes posed to look as if they were merely sleeping, sometimes in a more obviously posthumous arrangement. These photographs were treasured by families as a way of preserving a visual record of someone who was gone. The clothing worn by the deceased in these photographs was often their best clothing, their most fashionable, their most personal. The silk dress that had been worn to a dinner party, the velvet jacket that had been someone's favorite. These garments, photographed in the strange, still intimacy of the mourning portrait, become in retrospect something like relics, not of holiness, but of the simple reality of lives that were lived and then ended. These portraits remind us that behind every piece of Victorian clothing there was a person. Not just the person who made it, and not just the abstract consumer who wore it, but a specific individual with a name and a face and a history, who had chosen this particular garment, who had worn it in specific circumstances, who had experienced in it the pleasures and the discomforts and the social negotiations that fashion always involves. The dress outlasted the person. Sometimes, if it was fine enough and carefully enough preserved, it outlasted them by a century and more. And in a museum case or a conservator's storage box, it continues to carry something of them, the specific shape of their body, the things they might have spilled on it, the invisible residue of their sweat and their perfume and their breath. Fashion is, among other things, a way of being present in the world, of being seen, of leaving a trace. And the trace that Victorian fashion has left is complex. Beautiful objects and dangerous processes, gorgeous colors and toxic dyes, extraordinary craftsmanship and terrible exploitation, all wound together into the fabric of a past that is never quite as simple as it looks from a distance. The quiet rooms where we began, and now, as the night draws toward its deepest point, as the candle burns very low, let us come back to where we started, a dressing room. A wardrobe of silk and whalebone and velvet, a woman standing still while someone pulls a cord tighter around her waist. She is, in our imagination, somewhere in the 1860s. London, let us say, a middle-class household, not wealthy but comfortable. Her husband has a business. They have a house with servants. She has, this particular evening, a dinner engagement at the home of people who are slightly above her in the social hierarchy, and she wants to make a good impression. She has chosen her dress carefully. It is a silk taffeta, a warm amber color, not arsenic green, on this particular evening. She had a green dress, but she has not worn it recently. She is not sure why exactly. There is something she has read or heard someone say, and she has felt, without being able to quite articulate it, a vague reluctance. Her maid is lacing her corset. It is not extremely tight. She is not a woman who tight laces to excess. It is tight enough to give her the fashionable shape, tight enough that she will breathe a little shallowly for the rest of the evening, tight enough that the full dinner they will eat will sit a little uncomfortably in a stomach that has been given less space than it needs. She is used to this. She has been used to it since she was a girl. She does not know that the cotton in the lining of her bodice was grown in Georgia, picked by hands that did not choose to pick it. She does not know that the dye in the silk might contain trace compounds that are slowly, incrementally doing something to her liver that she will never notice until it is too late. She does not know the name of the dressmaker who made her gown, or whether that dressmaker is well or ill. She knows that she looks beautiful or close to it. She knows that her waist looks small and her posture looks good and her color is pleasing in the candlelight. She knows that she will walk into the dinner party and be seen correctly as a respectable woman of a certain class, dressed appropriately for an occasion among people of consequence. She knows these things and they matter to her. They are not shallow matters. They are the materials of her social life, of her position in the world, of the carefully maintained respectable existence that she and her husband have built. She is, in other words, a person, not a symbol, not a victim. Not a representative of false consciousness or of anything else abstract. A person in a dressing room, putting on a beautiful dress, going out for an evening. And around her, invisible to her, is the whole world we have spent this night exploring, the factories and the workshops and the dye houses and the fields and the oceans and the forests that produced everything she is wearing, the lives that went into the making of what she is putting on. She cannot see it. We can a little because we have spent this night looking, but seeing it does not resolve it. It does not make a neat lesson or a clear moral. It only makes the world more complex, more full, more heavy with the weight of things we cannot see. The colors of night, indigo and violet, and the last deep dark, and now let us simply rest in the colors. The indigo blue of a heavily dyed cotton fabric spread across a bed in a Victorian house. The color is extraordinary, deep and saturated, and somehow both dark and luminous at the same time. It has traveled from Bengal, from a field, from the hands of farmers who did not choose to grow it, through the hands of workers who processed it into a powder, through the London dye houses and the Lancashire mills and the West End dressmakers, to arrive here in this quiet room as a color, the emerald green of an artificial leaf lying on a dressing table. Small, improbable, beautiful. The arsenic in its dye is invisible. The hands that made it are invisible. The girl who made it, who is she? 19, 20, working in Bethnal Green or in Southwark in a room above a shop by the light that comes through a smudged window. We do not know. She is invisible, but the green is beautiful. It is the green of deep forest, the green of growing things, the green of spring, the black of a mourning dress hanging in a wardrobe. The dress has not been worn in 2 years. It was made for a specific grief, and that grief has moved into the background now, has become part of the permanent record of loss that every life accumulates. The dress smells faintly of the lavender that was placed in the wardrobe to keep moths away. It is heavy and somewhat stiff and very black. It will not be worn again for some time, perhaps never. Perhaps eventually it will be given away or cut down for something else. The white of a shirt collar, starched and pressed. The whiteness is almost aggressive in its brightness. It has been achieved through effort, the laundress's effort, the chemical effort of the washing soda and the bleaching water. It is the whiteness of work, paradoxically dressed up as the whiteness of cleanliness and virtue. It will be white for perhaps one wearing, and then it will need to be laundered again, and the process will begin again, and the laundress's hands will be again in the washing water. These are the colors of Victorian fashion. They are beautiful colors, genuinely beautiful, and they have shadows, the labor, the chemistry, the exploitation, the slow, quiet harm that are real and that were real even when no one was looking at them. We have been looking at them tonight. We have looked for a long time, slowly, carefully, following the thread from its beginning to its end, or to the nearest approach to an end that a thread as long and as tangled as this one has. Chapter 22, the long unwinding, toward sleep. The fire is lower now. The candle is very nearly spent. The night has reached that deepest, quietest hour when the world seems to hold its breath before turning slowly back toward morning. We have traveled a long way tonight. We have been to mills and workshops, to ballrooms and parlors, to reform meetings and parliamentary committees. We have met seamstresses and hatters and flower makers and laundresses and dressmakers' assistants. We have looked at beautiful things and found their shadows. We have tried to hold both the beauty and the shadow without letting either one disappear behind the other. And now it is time to begin the slow unwinding, to let the things we have learned settle gradually into the long and comfortable dark. Let us end not with a summary, not with a lesson, but with a few last quiet images. Images of the world we have been visiting, seen from a great distance or from very close. A factory in Lancashire, early morning before the machines have started. The mill workers are just arriving, walking through a pale gray light, their boots on the cobblestones making a sound that is the first sound of the working day. They carry their dinners wrapped in cloth. They are not thinking about fashion. They are thinking about the day ahead, about the noise that will start in 10 minutes and not stop for 12 hours, about whether they slept enough, about the cold. They are going to make cotton cloth. They do not think of it that way. They are going to work. A dressmaker's room in London. Late evening in the season. The gas lamps are lit. 3 women are working at a long table covered in silk, deep rose-colored silk, for a ball gown that must be ready by Thursday. Their needles move in and out of the fabric in a rhythm that is almost like breathing. They do not speak much. There is not much to say that the work does not already say. One of them has a headache that has been there since yesterday. Another has noticed that her eyes are slightly blurred when she looks up from the fabric. The close work is beginning to take its toll. The third is thinking about her sister, who has gone to work in a different establishment, and who wrote last week that the hours there are better, the food is tolerable. She is making a plan to ask for a transfer when the season is over. The silk shimmers in the gaslight. It will be beautiful, a field in Bengal, daytime hot. The indigo is being harvested. The workers are cutting the plants at the base and loading them into carts that will take them to the vats where they will be fermented and processed. The work is hard and the sun is strong and the pay will be poor. But the indigo is a vivid blue-green in the sunlight, almost unreal in its intensity, beautiful in the way that growing things can be beautiful before they are processed into something else. A hat shop in London. A man is trying on a top hat. The shop assistant, a young man, perhaps 18, careful and respectful in his manner, is adjusting the hat on the customer's head, tilting it slightly forward, then back. The customer looks in the mirror. He thinks, distinguished. The hat is perfect. He will take it. He leaves the shop with the hat in a box under his arm. The shop assistant goes back to his work. The hat had been made in Stockport, where the felt workers breathe compounds that no one has thought seriously about yet. The silk plush has come from the weaving district of London. The customer does not know any of this. The hat is a hat. He is distinguished. A parlor somewhere in the 1870s. A woman is reading by a lamp that casts a warm yellow circle of light. She is not thinking about fashion particularly. She is reading a novel, one of the sensation novels that Victorian women loved and that Victorian critics were somewhat suspicious of. The novel has a mystery in it, a secret, something hidden that will eventually be revealed. She is wearing her evening dress, a dark green silk with a small spray of artificial flowers at her waist. The flowers are made, she knows vaguely, by working women somewhere in the city. She does not know more than that. She does not think much about it. The evening is quiet. The fire is comfortable. The novel is absorbing. She turns a page, a garden somewhere in England in late summer. A woman is walking in a garden. She is dressed simply for the morning, a plain cotton dress, without the full apparatus of fashionable dress that she will wear in the afternoon when there are visitors expected. She is walking slowly, as people walk when they are not trying to get anywhere in particular. The garden is full of late summer flowers, dahlias and asters, and the last of the roses. She is thinking about nothing in particular, or about the flowers, or about the visitors, or about a letter she needs to write, or a piece of needlework she has promised herself she will finish this week. She is just a woman in a garden. She is not thinking about the history of the corset, or the toxicity of arsenic dyes, or the labor conditions in cotton mills. She is thinking about the flowers, and the light, and the quiet morning, and the particular pleasure of being in a garden before the day becomes full. She is, in other words, a human being, with a life that exists entirely outside the frameworks we have been using tonight to understand the world she lives in. She is not merely a data point in a social survey or a figure in a history of fashion. She is herself. She has a particular way of tilting her head when she is thinking. She has a laugh that comes more quickly than she expects sometimes. She has favorite things, colors, foods, times of day, people that are entirely her own. History does not keep these things. History keeps the structures, the patterns, the trends, the data. History keeps what can be documented, what can be measured, what was thought important enough to write down by the people who were in the business of writing things down. The woman in the garden is not in the historical record. She never wrote anything that survived. Her name might be in the census, but the census does not record how she walked or what she loved. She is there anyway. She was real. The garden was real. The morning was real. The sound of the house 18 night in the great Victorian houses, the hours after midnight had their own particular quality. The servants had been dismissed or had gone to their own quarters in the upper floors or the basement. The fires in the main rooms had been banked for the night, the coals glowing orange and then slowly cooling toward gray. The gas lamps had been turned down. The house settled around its silence like a cat arranging itself for sleep. But it was not truly silent, of course. No house is. There were the sounds of cooling metal in the fireplace, a gentle ticking, an occasional soft pop. The sounds of the house itself, the tiny creaks of settling wood and plaster, the sound of the wind if it was windy, the distant occasional sound of a cart on the street outside, the soft sound of breathing from the rooms where people slept. In the housekeeper's room, the books in which the household accounts were kept were lined up neatly on a shelf. The week's expenses were recorded there, the food, the coal, the small amounts paid to various tradespeople, the dressmaker's bill from the fitting last week, the payment to the laundress who came on Mondays, the small amount paid to a girl who helped with the pressing. These numbers are the other history, not the history of what was worn, but the history of what it cost. And the cost was borne in the end, not only in money, but in the ways we have been exploring all through this long night, in health, in time, in the labor of hands and eyes and lungs, in the slow and uncelebrated expenditure of human life in the service of beauty, the silence in the house, the sleeping woman upstairs, her corset laid over the chair by the window, her dress hung carefully in the wardrobe. She breathes more freely now without the corset, and her sleep is easier. The maid who helped her undress in her own small room at the top of the house, also sleeping. Her hands, which have done the lacing and the unlacing and the smoothing and the arranging, are resting now, still for the night. The seamstress, perhaps, somewhere across the city, also sleeping or trying to. The season is ending and the worst of the long nights are over for now. She is tired in a way that goes deeper than ordinary tiredness, a tiredness in the bones and behind the eyes that does not quite go away even after sleep. And the mill, far away in Lancashire, is quiet now, the machines stilled for the night, the cotton dust settling slowly in the dark, the workers gone to their homes and their rest. The mourning that comes slowly every night ends, eventually, in morning. Even the darkest nights, even the longest ones, even the nights when it seems that morning might not come, eventually they turn, and the darkness softens at its edges, and the light begins. The history of Victorian fashion, with all its shadows, did not end without progress. The reforms were real. The improvements were real. The people who fought for them were real, and their work mattered. The world that the Victorian reformers were working toward, a world of better working conditions, more rigorous occupational health standards, more humane treatment of workers, more honest regulation of the materials used in consumer goods, was not achieved in a single generation, but it was moved toward. The distance between a Victorian dressmaking workshop in 1840 and a modern sewing room is immense, measured in legal protections and safety standards and medical understanding and sheer quality of working life. The distance is not perfect. The problems of the fashion industry have not been solved. They have changed their form and their location. The harm has moved in many cases from the factories of the producing nations to the factories of the global south, from the English mill town to the Bangladeshi garment district. The logic is the same. The economic pressures are the same. The gap between the consumer and the producer, between the person who wears the thing and the person who makes it, is, if anything, wider, measured in actual miles, than it was in the Victorian era. But knowing this, having the capacity to see it, having the information about what is happening in the supply chain, having the vocabulary and the framework to think about it, is itself a kind of progress. The Victorian working woman who testified before a parliamentary committee was making her experience visible in a world that preferred not to see it, and the visibility she created, and that the reformers around her created, was the beginning of change. We are still in that process of making visible. The story is not over. The thread is still running, and now the morning is truly coming. You can feel it, even in the dark, a slight lessening, a slight softening of the quality of the darkness. The birds in the garden, if there is a garden, will begin soon. The first light, gray and tentative, will begin to outline the shapes of things. The window, the door, the chair with the dress folded over it. The dress is beautiful. It catches even this tentative, pre-dawn light in a particular way. The silk holds light differently from other fabrics, with a depth and a shimmer that is characteristic and lovely. It has been made by someone's hands. It has been colored with chemistry. It has traveled a long way to arrive here. It carries in its fibers the traces of everything that went into its making: the land, the labor, the ingenuity, the harm. It is just a dress, and it is also much more than just a dress. The house is very quiet. The fire is cold now, or nearly cold. The ashes are pale gray, and here and there a fragment of coal holds a last tiny glow, too small to provide any warmth but too stubborn to go out quite yet. The Victorian era is over. It has been over for 120 years. The people we have been talking about tonight are all gone. The seamstresses and the hatters and the laundresses and the silk weavers and the feather workers and the reformers and the women at the ball. They are all gone, and the world they inhabited is mostly gone, though here and there a building survives, or a street plan, or a piece of fabric in a museum case. What survives more thoroughly is the pattern of an industry that produces beautiful things at a cost that is borne by people who are not the ones who ultimately enjoy the beauty. That pattern, worn into the structure of the fashion industry across centuries, is what we have been tracing tonight. It did not begin in the Victorian era, and it did not end with it, but the Victorian era is where we looked tonight. and looking there carefully, slowly, by the light of a candle that is nearly spent, we have seen something of what beauty costs. We have tried to hold the full picture, the beauty and the cost, the progress and the harm, the individual human beings and the systems that shaped their lives. It is not a comfortable picture. But it is a true one, or as close to true as we could come in the course of one long night. And now let the night go. Let the images drift, the silk and the smoke, the needles and the candles, the green of the arsenic flowers, the black of the morning dress, the gleam of the top hat, the white of the collar, the wide, wide dome of the crinoline caught in firelight for a moment before the woman in it steps carefully back from the hearth. Let them drift and soften and blur at their edges and become part of the background landscape of sleep. The story does not end. It continues quietly in the morning, in the wardrobe, in the fabric of the ordinary day. But for now, for this night, for these hours, we can rest. The thread is laid down. The candle is out. The house is dark and quiet and still. Sleep well.